for significant injuries. It's a case that the police will update with more than 100 reported accidents elsewhere after the coldest night of the year so far. A police news conference due shortly. We'll have that live for you, and we're live at the scene as police are still urging motorists to stay off the roads. Are we heading for a constitutional conflict between Holyrood and Westminster? Nicola Sturgeon's warning the UK government against blocking gender legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament, and has accused ministers in London of using trans people as a political weapon. We'll have the latest on the row at the heart of Scottish devolution. Train drivers across the UK, yes, they're to strike again at the start of next month after rejecting the latest pay offer from rail companies. And the National Educational Union has announced yesterday that teachers will strike over pay in England and Wales on 7 dates in February and March. The Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, branding the move bitterly disappointing, but has pledged to hold talks with the unions over the course of this week. But just when will all this industrial unrest end? But some good news on the economy. Wages have grown at the fastest rate in more than 20 years. Average pay, including bonuses, rose by 6.4% between September and November compared with the same period in 2021, but still not keeping pace with rising prices. Of course, that's the problem for all these strikes as well. We'll have the latest snapshot of the UK economy. Any signs of those long-awaited green shoots coming through? The Met Police reviewing more than 1,600 cases of alleged sexual offences or domestic violence involving its own officers and staff. Well, this comes after a serving officer turned out to be one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders. How did David Carrick evade checks and vetting? And what now from the Metropolitan Police after this latest sex scandal? Should the force itself be on probation? And as ever, get in touch, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We want to hear your take on all of today's top stories. But before that, the latest headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. A very good afternoon from the GB newsroom at 2 minutes past 12. A major incident has been declared after a double-decker bus overturned in Somerset. Emergency services are currently at the scene on the A39 Quantock Road after a crash involving a double-decker bus and a motorcyclist at around 6 o'clock this morning. The bus was taking workers to the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station. Avon and Somerset Police are urging people to only travel if essential due to the icy and freezing weather conditions. And we're expecting to hear from the police there in Somerset shortly. Former Met Police officer David Carrick has been sacked by the Metropolitan Police at a misconduct hearing held in his absence in West London. It's after he pleaded guilty to 49 offences, including dozens of rapes and sexual offences over an 18-year period. The Met Police is now investigating over 1,000 cases of sexual offences and domestic abuse involving its staff. Met Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley says they'll work to identify and investigate offenders within the police service.
This man abused women in the most disgusting manner. It is sickening. We've let women and girls down, and indeed we've let Londoners down. The women who suffered and survived this violence have been unimaginably brave and courageous in coming forward. And I do understand also that this will lead to some women across London questioning whether they can trust the Met to keep them safe. We have failed, and I'm sorry. He should not have been a police officer.
Women's rights activist Patsy Stevenson says public attitude towards the Met Police has changed.
I used to trust the police. You know, women want to be able to trust police because who are we supposed to go to? But time and time again, they're showing us that we can't trust them. And saying sorry but not changing the behaviour, the apology just feels absolutely like there's no point in it. There's no point in apologising if you're not going to change what's happening.
New figures show that wages have failed to keep up with soaring prices, more so than at any point since records began. Average pay rose by 6.4% in the previous quarter. But when taking inflation into account, it means real-term pay dropped by 2.6%. The Office for National Statistics also says the unemployment rate rose by 0.2% to reach 3.7% over the same period. In response, the Chancellor says the labour market remains resilient and the best way to help people's wages go further is to stick to plans to halve inflation this year. Economist Jack Kennedy told GB News the trends we can expect to see this year.
We are starting to see employers responding a little bit to the uncertain economic climate and sort of easing off the accelerator in terms of demand for full-time staff. But certainly, a lot of employers are trying to still fill staffing gaps, so certainly turning to part-time staff.
The Scottish Conservative leader has backed the UK government's move to block Holyrood's controversial gender bill reforms. Douglas Ross says the legislation seriously damages the rights of women. It's the first time Westminster has made an order under the Scotland Act to prevent a law from Holyrood going to royal assent. The First Minister of Scotland has called Westminster's decision a full frontal attack on the Scottish Parliament. MPs have voted in favour of anti-strike laws, with unions opposing the legislation. The strikes bill would see workers having to provide minimum levels of service during industrial action. It means bosses would be able to legally sack employees who choose not to work on strike days. Meanwhile, the ASLEF union says its train drivers will strike next month after their union rejected a pay offer. They'll strike on the 1st and 3rd of February, which will coincide with a walkout by 100,000 civil servants in their dispute over pay and jobs. Other upcoming industrial action includes strikes by the Royal College of Nursing and teachers. 90% of National Education Union members in England and Wales have voted in favour of action. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan told GB News striking is not the answer.
It is so disappointing because we worked very hard. We were one of the very few departments to actually get additional funding to make sure that we didn't have head teachers having to make those type of choices. And of course now we have still one union who is now putting our children's education and recovery after the pandemic at risk, and it's really, really disappointing.
To hear from police there about the crash that happened this morning.
Inspector.
Thank you.
No problem.
Go ahead.
So is the phone all right for you where it is? Right.
Will you clarify numbers in your statement, please? Like how many on the bus, how many injured?
I've got some numbers for you, yes. So if you're ready, I shall start. My name is Inspector Rebecca Wells-Cole from Avon and Somerset Police, and I would like to read the following joint statement on behalf of all the agencies who've been involved in the incident this morning. At 6 a.m. today, Tuesday the 17th of January, we were called to the A39 Quantock Road in Bridgewater following a report of a road-related incident involving a double-decker bus and a motorcyclist. We can now confirm the double-decker bus was carrying 70 Hinkley Point C workers and the bus driver when it overturned. The incident was initially declared as a major incident due to the number of people involved and the resources required. This has since been stood down. Emergency services have been on the scene since receiving the first 999 call, and we can confirm there have been no fatalities at this time. 54 patients were triaged at the scene, and it's too soon to confirm if any of these patients have life-threatening injuries. However, 26 patients are being treated as walking wounded. A number of those treated at the scene have been taken to Musgrove Park Hospital, Bridgewater Minor Injury Unit and Southmead Hospital. It may take us some time to recover the bus and to clear the debris from the road. I would like to take this opportunity to advise the local residents to only travel where absolutely essential due to the icy road conditions caused by the cold temperatures overnight and the excess water on the road. If you do need to travel along the A39, please be advised that we may be at the scene for some time and request you seek alternative routes. Where driving is essential, please take extra precautions and care. I'll now take 2 to 3 questions only.
What's the cause so far? I can understand.
It's a live investigation at this point, so I can't comment. I don't know.
Was it travelling to or from Hinkley?
It was travelling to site. to Hinkley Point C.
You mentioned 54 people have been triaged. Are there any life-changing injuries?
It's not known at this time. It's too soon to confirm.
So it was involving a motorbike. Did it hit the motorbike, go round the motorbike?
It's a live investigation. I don't know. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like to take you...
Hello, what's going to happen this afternoon here at the scene in terms of the investigation?
It's a live investigation that will continue throughout the afternoon. Thank you very much. Have a safe journey home.
Thank you.
So there we have it then.
Well, that's the latest we're getting here on GB News Live from Avon and Somerset Police after that major bus crash down in Somerset at 6 o'clock this morning on the A39. These are the latest pictures we're getting with, as you just heard there, police still urging motorists to take care and avoid the scene. This was the scene on that major road as the icy conditions met some, I think, 100 accidents reported overall, but this is the most serious. The bus in collision with a motorcyclist, as we heard there from the police, and as a result, a major incident declared. Thankfully, no fatalities, as we just heard. However, a significant number of people have been hurt. They're still being treated. It is still a live investigation, as we were hearing there from the police. And we had many people inside that bus banging on the windows, as you saw from those pictures, with rescuers trying to get to them, but successfully getting through the windows to rescue. Some 70 workers heading to the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station on board. And basically, we are saying that we are being told from Hinkley Point that those workers are still not travelling along that road because of those conditions. So clearly no work going on at that power station as it's still being constructed. We'll have more on that, of course, as we get it from our correspondent down there in the West Country. But let's turn to other matters now. The Metropolitan Police officer who admitted to being a serial rapist being dismissed from the force following a misconduct hearing this morning. Well, David Carrick was found to be one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders after pleading guilty to dozens of rapes and sexual offences. The 48-year-old attacked at least 12 women over an 18-year period throughout his career at the Met. Let's get more now with our national reporter Paul Hawkins, who was following the hearing today. I think actually we've just lost Paul for the moment, but we can tell you that Downing Street has declined to say whether the Prime Minister will meet the Met Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley in the wake of this case. His official spokesman telling reporters, "We'll set out any future plans with the Prime Minister in the normal way," but reiterating that the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, was in regular contact with the Commissioner. Then, in reply to a question as to whether there'd be an official inquiry into the Carrick case, the Prime Minister's official spokesman said, "We are discussing the scope of Part 2 of the Angelini inquiry with Lady Angelini, so the Home Office will provide updates." However, Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, saying the Met's failure to root out Carrick from its ranks reflected cultural issues within the force. Well, we can now speak to Paul Hawkins, who's been following this hearing this morning. Paul, clearly these particular events in terms of this disciplinary hearing pretty quick to go through the proceedings after starting in December. The question, of course, from many others is why weren't such proceedings in place earlier after reports seemingly about his behaviour ignored effectively by the Met, it seems?
Yeah, that is a great question, and there's no answer to it at the moment. Frankly, what's surprising is that it took just a little under 2 hours to reach the conclusion to dismiss him for gross misconduct this morning. Just to read you what the Metropolitan Police lawyer Hill Bennett had to say during the hearing. David Carrick not represented during the hearing itself, but Hill Bennett saying that Carrick's crimes had a catastrophic effect on his victims and their families. He described his offences as heinous, targeted and deliberate, and said policing has taken a step backwards as a result of these convictions. And that's because the Met has had to say sorry to the victims of David Carrick, because on 9 occasions his name came to light, both to the Met and to other police forces, over allegations of rape, domestic violence and harassment between 2000 and 2021. and no one in the force went through his record. Indeed, during the summer of 2021, following Sarah Everard's murder, when the Met Police said we are going to double down on our commitment to protect women, they didn't look through David Carrick's record after an allegation was made against him of rape. And it was only when a second allegation by a separate woman was made of rape and charges followed, and he made his first public appearance in court, that other women then came forward, and then the case snowballed from there. So in terms of what the Met Police Commissioner Mark Rowley has been saying today, he's been doing the media rounds this morning. He said they failed the Met. He said he's sorry and that he should have not been a police officer, and he couldn't promise women in London that there were still officers serving in the force that were not themselves sex offenders, but he's vowed to ruthlessly identify hundreds of officers or staff who needed to be kicked out of the force. And what he's referring to is Operation Onyx, which at the moment is investigating 1,000 cases covering approximately 800 officers and looking into their background and going over their case files again. And he said that there will be some incidents, some officers that will have to leave the force. He said the vast majority will still continue to serve, and that those incidents that they're investigating, those cases that they're investigating, probably won't be serious, but there will be some officers who have to leave. So this certainly isn't over for the Met. And Suella Braverman has said it is clear that standards and culture need to change in policing. The Home Secretary expected to announce a review of police disciplinary procedures, and indeed Baroness Casey, who's carrying out this public inquiry at the moment into standards and culture in the Met, has written to the Home Secretary saying that there needs to be a public inquiry into how David Carrick, how his pattern of behaviour wasn't picked up earlier. And she's suggesting that that Dame Angelini's inquiry that you mentioned yourself, Mark, maybe that should be extended to include David Carrick, or indeed there's a separate inquiry which Baroness Casey has said that she would be happy to undertake herself.
Yeah, indeed so. Paul, thank you for that. Indeed, we are expecting a statement from the Home Secretary, or at least a comment in the Commons at about 12:30. We'll update people with that. Paul, for the moment, thank you very much indeed for that. But actually, let me just update you that we're getting more from the Prime Minister's spokesman, who said that Rishi Sunak opened this morning's Cabinet meeting by telling ministers that everyone would have been appalled by the crimes of David Carrick. According to a readout of the meeting, the Prime Minister said the case undermined public confidence in the police, essential for them to do their jobs, and said that people like Carrick should never have been a police officer and that we need to see real change quickly, adding that the police must address failings that happened in this case, restore public confidence and do everything possible to ensure women and girls are safe in their communities and homes. As we were saying, we were expecting Suella Braverman perhaps to say more in the Commons fairly shortly. We'll have that live for you as it comes through. Now, the UK government will block a bill passed by the Scottish Parliament to make it easier for people to change their legal gender. Now, it's the first time that Westminster has invoked the power to veto a Scottish law for having an impact on the rest of the UK. Well, a bill passed in December made Scotland the first nation to back a self-identification process for changing gender. The Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, argued, though, it would have a significant impact on wider equality law. But Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, describing that as an attack on Scottish democracy. Well, let's cross to Downing Street now and get the latest with our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, it appears to have moved on from an issue about transgender rights, a big constitutional bust-up between Scotland and Westminster.
Yeah, indeed. But we'll have to see how that plays out. You know, after all, the Scottish Parliament, it's got lots and lots of powers. In fact, it's got more powers than any other devolved parliament in the world. But it is a devolved parliament. At the end of the day, power in our constitution rests in the UK Parliament, just down the road from here at Westminster. And the government would argue that they are fully within their constitutional right, fully within their legal right to take this action to block the royal assent, effectively evoking Section 35 of the Scottish Act from way back in 1998. Now, is this provoking a row? You bet it is, not least of all because it's never happened before, and clearly the SNP will want to say that this is Westminster meddling in the affairs of a Scottish Parliament bill that was passed with an overwhelming majority, it must be said. It wasn't just SNP MSPs that backed this bill, but indeed Labour as well. However, this all comes down to where effectively power resides in this country and the laws that affect people in this country. And the government will argue, if it goes to court, and there is a big question if it goes to court, that in the end they will prove that this does contravene the Equalities Act, the UK Equalities Act, and thus it is not acceptable under UK law. Now, there is another option open to Nicola Sturgeon. Rather than taking this to court, this is what the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, would suggest, is to amend the bill in the Scottish Parliament so that it does work within the Equalities Act. But in essence, is the SNP willing to do that? At the end of the day, they potentially are hoping to make a lot of political capital out of all of this in suggesting that this is another sign that rule from London is having negative consequences for the Scottish people. Now, when it comes down to it, on this issue of the actual bill itself, on the issue at play here, there are polls suggesting that actually it's not terribly popular in Scotland, despite that majority in Parliament. I think one poll suggesting around 2/3 of people do not agree with it. And it is having ramifications beyond that constitutional question and indeed the suggestions about whether this could come into play in England or indeed the rest of the UK. The Education Secretary this morning saying that on this contention about whether the age of 16 was an appropriate age at which you could change your gender, she seems to suggest it was, saying that she had a job at 16 and she thought it was not too young to make that decision. Interestingly, the government saying that is a personal opinion of the Education Secretary and not the government's view. And just finally in all of this, Mark, where are the Labour Party? Well, Keir Starmer made it clear he didn't agree with that figure of 16. He thought it was too low. But also, Labour haven't come out against all of this, against or for the government's decision, somewhat sitting on the fence. And I think in the end, they're going to have to make up their mind about whether they back the government in this row or whether they back the Scottish Parliament and indeed their own MSPs north of the border to back this legislation in the first place.
Very quickly, though, Darren, in terms of if Nicola Sturgeon does go for judicial review, a legal process, how would that work when we've already got the Scotland Act, which sets out that the Scottish Parliament should not legislate in areas where there could be an adverse effect on GB-wide legislation? I mean, i.e. it is already set down in law.
Well, I think they would try to prove that actually this doesn't necessarily contravene the Equalities Act. But you're right, that's why the UK government thinks it's got a pretty solid case in all of this. It'll start in Scotland, but it could very much well end up here at the UK Supreme Court. This is a row that's very, very, very much far from over.
OK, thank you for that. To be continued, as they say. Darren in Downing Street, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, we've got our business and economics editor, Liam Halligan, waiting in the traps to assess the latest unemployment and wage figures. Is it good or bad news for the UK's battered economy? And the latest on those teacher strikes too, that before a quick break for you.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons? I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, how about a few more strikes for you? 9 out of 10 teachers with the National Education Union have now voted for strike action, though the ballot turnout only just reached the legal minimum required by law. But it now plans 7 days of walkouts in February and March, saying that any individual school, though, will only be affected by 4 of those days in that section. Now, the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, spoke to GB News a little earlier today.
It is so disappointing because we worked very hard. We were one of the very few departments to actually get additional funding to make sure that we didn't have head teachers having to make those type of choices. And of course now we have still one union who is now putting our children's education and recovery after the pandemic at risk, and it's really, really disappointing.
Let's cross now to the National Education Union HQ, and our national reporter Ellie Costello is waiting there for us. And Ellie, it seems they are quite determined to push their point on a staggered series of stoppages, but of course yet more problems for mum and dad at home trying to not just sort out cover for the kids at home, but worries about the kids' education as well.
Yes, absolutely. Good afternoon to you, Mark. Homeschooling could return as quickly as next month. The first strike date is now set for the 1st of February, and national strikes following on the 16th and 17th of March as well. There will be regional dates in there as well. That's after 9 out of 10 teacher members of the NEU voted to go out on strike. Only 53% turnout, though. So the government is saying they've only just managed to get this strike through. But the difference between what we saw in the pandemic when students were being homeschooled and the teachers' strike that we're talking about now is teachers do not have a responsibility to set work for their pupils. So we could see pupils at home with no work being set for them, meaning that parents will have to look at other resources in order to educate their children. If you're a GCSE student in this country, it does mean that you've only had 1 year of uninterrupted learning in your secondary school experience. So of course there will be concern there about their upcoming exam season in May, and of course what this means for their exam results come the end of the summer as well. Lots of concern from parents and pupils, but teachers say that they've only had the 5% pay rise in 2022. It's not anywhere in line with inflation, and that pay rise so far has come from existing school budgets. So it's only the students, they say, that have lost out. It means that they might have fewer school trips or fewer classroom assistants. They also want to look at the way that these pay rises are coming to teachers. That's why they're going out on strike. But Mark, this does mean that teachers are now the latest in a long line of public sector workers who are walking out this winter.
Indeed so. The industrial unrest continues. Ellie, thank you very much for updating us there. More, of course, on those strikes as we get it. Let's just bring you a bit of breaking news from the BBC. Radio 2-star veteran Ken Bruce has announced he's leaving after 45 years. He's jumping ship to commercial rivals, and he's taking Popmaster with him. He told his listeners on air this morning, nothing stays the same forever. Presented his weekday mid-morning programme since 1986. The latest to leave, of course, with big names, including Steve... I've forgotten his name now. It's such a big name. However, just reading here what they're saying. Ken Bruce, the latest after Paul O'Grady, that's right, and Steve Wright, and Graham Norton, and Simon Mayo. So it's a long list of names having left and replaced with a younger lineup. Ken Bruce, though, saying he's enjoyed his time at the BBC. Well, talking of losing jobs, UK unemployment rose to 3.7% from 3.5% in the 3 months leading up to November. That's according to the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics. Latest official numbers on pay also published, with wage packets going up, but of course nowhere near the rate of inflation. Well, joining us now, our economics and business editor Liam Halligan with On the Money. So unemployment up, not too much. Wages up, but not too much. Good, bad or indifferent?
Lots of numbers flying about here today. And welcome back, Mark, by the way.
Thank you very much, yes, to Broken Britain.
We've actually seen in the months from September to November, I can put them up on a graphic here, we've seen a huge pay rise with pay across the economy up 6.4%. And that's the biggest increase in that monthly period since 2001. And if we can break that down with the next graphic, private sector pay during that period, September to November, that was up 7.1%, Mark. And public sector pay was up 3.3%. So private sector pay is going up more than public sector pay. That will surely feed into these wage negotiations. But having said that, public sector pay, in pounds and pence, is still higher on average than public sector pay. And a lot of people in the private sector would say, and public sector people get better pensions, more sick leave, more flexibility, and so on. But here's the real headline for me. The next graphic, Mark, pay after inflation across the economy, when you include that inflation during that period, September to November, the rise in the cost of living, what we call real terms pay after pay rises, down by 3.4%, and that's the biggest fall since 2009. So what we have here, Mark, and it's quite difficult to get your head around it, so I'll say it again, we have the biggest increase in actual pay in pounds and pence since 2001 over the last months of last year, but we've had the biggest fall in post-inflation pay. This is what inflation does. When the cost of living is rising, these hefty pay rises don't actually add up to pay rises.
And that's the conundrum, of course, given the situation with the government and the unions at the moment. The government's saying, look, in cash terms, we can't afford this. The union's saying, well, hold on, looking at the pay packets and what it means when you get home and work in what cost of living crisis is doing. I mean, ASLEF, the latest, of course, I mean, the train operating companies saying, look, we're offering something that's going to give them £5,000 a year more. But as they say, well, it doesn't meet 10.7% inflation rate. We're looking at that as basically what we need. So we've still got this conundrum. What does the government do? Does it stay and stick and say, look, let's just see what inflation is going to be in the spring and summer? Or do they try and give one-off payments, maybe, as they've talked about with the nurses?
A lot of employers are using one-off payments because a one-off payment feels good now. It's like a bonus. But you don't have to then pay it every single year.
With the national insurance added in and everything.
Going forward, that's right. I think what else is worth saying here, Mark, is that tomorrow we've got the next inflation number coming out. Now, you'll remember that inflation fell from its 41-year high in October. It was 11.1%. In November, it fell to 10.7%. Tomorrow, I'll be reporting on GB News on the breakfast show from 7 a.m. About the inflation number for December. And if that inflation number is markedly lower than 10.7%, the government will say, even though real wages at the moment are falling because of inflation, the government will say, look, guys, to the trade unions, inflation's coming down a lot. Inflation, as Rishi Sunak has said, they will say, is going to halve by the end of the year. So if we're offering you a 6% rise this year and maybe a 5% rise next year, these are real terms post-inflation pay increases. And so these headline macroeconomic numbers take on huge political significance to try and break these strikes.
And your quick, educated guess on that figure tomorrow, because, I mean, we've got the dollar higher against the pound, so fuel, for instance, is slightly cheaper, and those costs...
You mean the pound is higher against the dollar?
Yeah, so buying fuel effectively, it becomes...
So the pound has recovered quite a lot, as you rightly say. That means to import fuel is cheaper, not least because fuel is priced in dollars. So I wrote at the weekend that I actually think inflation will start to fall quite quickly now throughout this year. I do think the cost of living squeeze is very, very real, and it's not like prices are going to come down, so no one's going to suddenly feel richer. But I do at least think the rate of increase in prices is going to abate quite soon. So I would expect tomorrow's December inflation number to be lower than the November inflation number. So lower
single figures.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I wouldn't be surprised if it's certainly lower than 10.7%. And I don't think Rishi Sunak's going to have any problem meeting his end of year pledge to have inflation half of where it was when he gave that pledge in early January. So this is about 5%.
Right, and this is the important thing, because it buys the government some room in terms of negotiations with the union, and the unions may well have to reconsider the negotiating stance.
It allows the government to paint the unions in the face of the court of public opinion, which is what is all important, and indeed the government can paint the Labour Party as being unreasonable if they're not accepting reasonable pay demands. I mean, we mentioned ASLEF earlier, right? The ASLEF drivers have just voted to reject a pay offer of 8%. Right. And so we know there are going to be strikes now next month.
We have to break away because we've got in the Commons, thank you for that, the Home Secretary making a statement about that Met Police officer, David Carrick. This is Suella Braverman.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will make a statement on misconduct and vetting in the Metropolitan Police Service following the horrific David Carrick case, and I thank you for your statement just there. Yesterday was a dark day for British policing and the Metropolitan Police, as an officer admitted being responsible for a monstrous campaign of abuse. Mr. Speaker, I am sure the whole House will want to join me in expressing my sympathy to the victims and thank them for their courage in coming forward. It is intolerable for them to have suffered as they have. They were manipulated and isolated and subjected to horrific abuse. For anyone to have gone through such torment is harrowing, but for it to have happened at the hands of someone they entrusted to keep people safe is almost beyond comprehension. The victims have shown extraordinary strength and courage. Their testimonies were essential in ensuring that Carrick faces justice for his crimes. It's thanks to them that this vile predator has been taken off our streets, and the public are safer as a result. Mr. Speaker, the police perform a unique and critical function in our society. Every day, thousands of decent, hard-working police officers perform their duties with the utmost professionalism. They feel pride in putting on their uniform and want only the best for the communities that they serve. I know that they will share our collective disgust that a fellow officer could be responsible for such a despicable betrayal of everything that they stand for. It's imperative that this cannot happen again. And so I'm grateful for Lady Eilish Angelini's assurance that she will look at this heinous case as part of her inquiry. Mr. Speaker, from the moment I became Home Secretary to change, public trust is precious. Our model of policing by consent cannot work effectively without it. I discussed this case yesterday with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, and I'm encouraged by the action that he has taken so far with his team to root out officers who are not fit to wear the badge. This effort is being spearheaded by a new anti-corruption and abuse command. But there is still some way to go to ensure that the force can command the trust of the people that it serves. It is vital that the Metropolitan Police and other forces double down on their efforts to root out corrupt officers. This may mean more shocking cases come to light in the short term. It's a matter of the utmost importance that there are robust processes in place to stop the wrong people joining the police in the first place, which is why the government has invested in improving recruitment processes and supporting vetting as part of over £3 billion that we have provided for the Police Uplift programme. I expect this work to continue at pace and for all Chief Constables to prioritise delivery of the recommendations made by the Police Inspectorate's recent report on vetting, counter-corruption and misogyny. It's now for the Metropolitan Police to demonstrate that they have an effective plan in place to rapidly improve their vetting processes. Much of the impetus for change must come from within policing, but this government will continue leading from the front. As I've been clear, we are bringing forward part 2 of the Angelini inquiry to make recommendations on how forces can improve culture and tackle the root causes of police criminality and misconduct. The inquiry was established by the then Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, and I pay tribute to her for her commitment and leadership on these critical issues. As well as ensuring vetting processes are watertight, there must be fair and effective arrangements for dealing with those who behave or act in a wholly unacceptable way while serving. Baroness Casey has recently identified concerns with the misconduct and dismissals process within the Metropolitan Police. It takes too long, it doesn't command the confidence of police officers, and it's procedurally burdened. Bureaucracy and process appear to have prevailed over ethics and common sense. That's why I've announced an internal review into police dismissals. The review's terms of reference are being published today. Mr. Speaker, this case will rightly throw a spotlight once again on women's safety. No one should suffer abuse or feel frightened or harassed, whether they are at home, out and about, or online. We are taking concerted action to prevent violence against women, support victims and survivors, relentlessly pursue perpetrators and strengthen the system as a whole. On rape specifically, we are focused on delivering improvements across the board so that victims get the support they deserve and cases are pursued rigorously from report to court. There have been some important steps forward since the publication of the Rape Review in 2021. The number of referrals and charges have increased nationally, while new operating models for the investigation and prosecution of rape are being developed through Operation Soteria. Mr. Speaker, none of this can undo the suffering of Carrick's victims. But I can assure the House that this government will not shy away from challenging the police to meet the standards we all expect of them. Change must happen, and as Home Secretary, I will do everything in my power to ensure that it does. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a truly shocking and appalling case, and I welcome the statement today. A serving police officer admitting to some of the most serious and devastating crimes. I join the Home Secretary in giving tribute to the bravery of the victims who have come forward, but we have to face up to the further evidence that this case has brought up of appalling failures in the police vetting and misconduct processes that are still not being addressed by the government and are not being addressed in this statement. And I would say to the Home Secretary that given the scale of the problems, not just in this case, but in previous cases as well, her statement is very weak and it shows a serious lack of leadership on something that is so grave and affects confidence in policing as well as serious crimes. We've seen repeated failures to respond or take seriously allegations of violence against women by a serving police officer, by other serving police officers, allegations of domestic abuse not taken seriously in the vetting processes, and in this case, a failure to suspend, for example, a failure to suspend David Carrick when rape allegations were made in July 2021, even though the Met Police knew there had been domestic abuse allegations 2 years previously. A misconduct process that concluded there was no case to answer despite the repeated alarms being raised, a full vetting check not triggered, and David Carrick's permission to carry firearms restored. And most shocking of all is that this happened at the height of the alarm about Wayne Couzens and the murder, the deeply disturbing murder of Sarah Everard. And this undermines confidence for women, confidence for victims, but also for police officers who are working so hard, and especially for women police officers who may themselves have reported misogynistic abuse, and for officers who are doing excellent work every day to tackle violence against women and girls and know that confidence in that work is being undermined. Now, we support the Commissioner's, the new Met Commissioner's determination to take action, but this is not just about the Met. We have had concerns about misogyny and culture raised in Sussex, in Hampshire, in Derbyshire, in Gwent, in Police Scotland, in other forces, and there has been a lack of leadership from the government on police standards for years. After the truly appalling murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer, Home Office ministers promised change. The then Home Secretary promised to set up processes that would prevent this happening again. And that has badly failed. There are still no legal requirements on vetting. Forces can effectively do what they want. They don't even have to check employment history and character references, and some don't. They don't even have to interview people beforehand. And when the Inspectorate came up with damning conclusions that hundreds, if not thousands, of police officers who should have failed vetting, including corrupt and predatory officers who have committed, including officers who have committed offences on indecent exposure and domestic abuse, are still in the job, the policing minister refused to even make it a requirement for police forces to follow the recommendations of the Inspectorate. They just shrugged and said that it was a matter for police forces to follow. There's been no response to make this compulsory to follow vetting guidance, no requirement to make it compulsory to follow the reforms. And all we've got in this statement is a continuation of existing Angelini review and a new review, another one on dismissals, which I welcome because there are concerns that the dismissals process has become more difficult and has become worse since well-intended reforms were introduced but have not worked as intended. So I welcome that review, but it was announced in October and it still hasn't started, and all the Home Secretary has done is re-announce it today. And some of the things that police forces have been doing to tackle misogyny or to increase diversity, to improve their response to communities and to crime, the Home Secretary has dismissed as woke, even though they are about tackling some of the most serious crimes. And it's about, too, how seriously they tackle violence against women and girls more broadly, where we know that the prosecution rate, the charge rate for rape, has dropped to a shameful 1.5%. It has dropped by 2/3 over the last 7 years. And again, Home Office ministers promised that tackling violence against women and girls would become part of the compulsory strategic policing requirement. It has been reported that that has not happened. Can she confirm that 9 months after ministers announced it, she has not made it a requirement in the strategic policing review to prioritise violence against women and girls? Mr. Speaker, after the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer, Labour called for change. After the horrific murders of Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, Labour called for leadership. After the shameful case of Child Q, Labour called for reform. After the shocking Charing Cross station report, Labour demanded action. After the Stephenport inquiry, Labour called for reform. And after the cases right across the country of abuse or of misogyny, Labour has demanded change. Conservative ministers promised action would be taken, but they have failed to do so. Labour will change the law. Labour will overhaul the vettings, misconduct and standards system, because it is time to change. And we are letting down police officers across the country who do excellent work and who are being let down by these failures in the system. And most of all, women are being let down. It's too late for all the warm words in the Home Secretary's statement. What is she actually going to do to make sure that standards are raised?
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It's a disappointment that the Shadow Home Secretary has resorted to cheap political lines. I don't think today is a day for political attacks. There's been a human tragedy at the heart of this case, and ultimately politics should be set aside. I'm willing to work with anybody, the Inspectorate, the overriding politician responsible for the Met Police, a Labour politician, Sadiq Khan. I'm willing to work with all chief constables. I'm willing to work with everybody in this chamber so that we bring about change and safety and improved standards in our policing forces around the country. And that's why I support the statement of the police commissioner, the Met Commissioner yesterday, where he accepts that there were failings. There's no question about that. There were failings in the system when it came to vetting and checking. There were failures by the Met Police. It's clear that culture and standards in police need to change. And that's why I'm clear as well that I'm not going to shy away from challenging chief constables all around the country on the standards that they uphold and instill in their individual forces. Police constables and police leaders have all accepted the recommendations set out in the comprehensive report by the Inspectorate, commissioned by this government in response to the Sarah Everard murder, to look into more closely what procedures have been put in place and how well they've been working when it comes to vetting and checking, monitoring and disciplinary processes relating to policing. It was clear that report identified several concerns and failings in policing. The bulk of those recommendations were aimed at chief constables, the College of Policing and the National Policing Council. All of those recommendations have been accepted, and we're closely monitoring the delivery of those improvements in rigour and standards when it comes to the entry processes, vetting and checking of new recruits to policing. We've also ensured that Lady Angelini will be looking more closely into culture in policing, to root out, so that we can better implement and deliver systems that will root out misogyny, predatory behaviour, sexual assault or any other offensive behaviour that might lead to criminal activity within policing. But let me be clear, I'm very proud of this government's track record on supporting women and girls in the criminal justice system. It's this government that has put into place a groundbreaking Operation Soteria around the country to improve practices when it comes to the police investigation of rape and serious sexual offences, the prosecution phase and the court resolution phase. And we're already seeing signs of improvement when it comes to supporting victims of these heinous crimes through our criminal justice system. It's this government that introduced a raft of new offences to better protect women and girls in society, whether that's upskirting, our landmark Domestic Abuse Act, which expanded the definition and the protections available to victims of domestic abuse, stalking, female genital mutilation, forced marriage. I'm very proud of that leadership and that initiative that this government has demonstrated when it came to standing up for women and girls. But we won't be complacent. There is, of course, further we can go and more we can do. I'm keen to focus on the solutions and move forward so that we don't see repeated incidents and tragedies like the one we're talking about today.
Mr. Speaker, it's a sorry and, in fact, tragic state of affairs that the House is convening to discuss this issue again today. There's no doubt about that, it really is. And I think the Home Secretary will fully recognise that reviews have been commissioned since 2021 that led to the Angelini inquiry, and it's part 2 that obviously this will feature into, and I think the Home Secretary, it'd be welcome if she could explain
So that's former Home Secretary Priti Patel there on her feet following that statement from Suella Braverman on the David Carrick case. The Home Secretary saying it was a dark day for the Met Police and intolerable that his victims had to suffer as they had. In terms of the way forward, she said the impetus for change must come from within the police. But vetting procedures must be watertight, announcing an internal review into police dismissals. But Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, saying there had been failures of leadership from this government on police matters. Still no legal requirements, she said, on the vetting procedures. Suella Braverman replying that it was disappointing that Labour were making cheap political lines. That was not the day for that, she said. We shall continue to have more reaction to that, of course, with Carrick having been dismissed from the Met at a hearing earlier this morning. Now, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has signed a book deal with the publishers William Collins, owned by HarperCollins, documenting his time in the ministerial seat. Although it's yet to have a title or a confirmed publishing date, it's already been described as a memoir like no other, with momentous documentation of events seen by the United Kingdom in recent times, close quotes. Well, let's speak now to political commentator and former political correspondent and an author himself, of course, Peter Spencer, who joins us now. Peter, thank you for your time. Is it a blockbuster or maybe, as we used to say for some, a bonkbuster, given his sort of personal history in times past?
I think it will have the charm of novelty to the extent that this, when it out, will actually A, sell extremely well, and B, be read by people. And as you rightly point out, Boris Johnson's time in office and indeed his life is speckled, to say the least. But I think when we look at this situation, what we can anticipate is a kind of a tell-all. And also, one of his great heroes, of course, was Winston Churchill. And Winston famously said, "History will be kind to me because I can write it." That's Boris's idea too.
As you say, I mean, he's written about the Churchill effect, of course, in one of his books. He is an extremely accomplished writer, but are we likely to get the inside story, particularly on the things that matter, such as Partygate and, of course, the whole issue of Dominic Cummings?
He will certainly give his angle on the story, but I have to say that the other big angle on the story will come from the House of Commons Privileges Committee, which, although we haven't heard so much about it lately, it has been beavering away. Yeah. And in the not too distant future, we'll get the public hearings, and God alone knows what's going to come out of that. I mean, there was a little while ago when it would appear though there were one or two couples disappearing for, well, I won't say the word, of course, on daytime television, but it does rhyme with nag. And Johnson making the joke about how this is not a very socially distant party clearly demonstrates that he thought it was all a bit of a hoot, and who knows, far be it for me to say whether we were having a little hoot while we were at.
Yeah, and he's made a few bob from the speaking circuit, of course, out in the States since leaving office, and I guess there'll be a pretty fat check on this one as well.
Of which he is in considerable need, it has to be said. I mean, yeah, on the speaking circuit, there's one spectacular evening when he contrived to make twice his entire prime ministerial salary in one evening for a little cosy chat and one thing and another. But of course, he has got a considerable number of children to maintain, and he has actually wrapped up a fair few debts. Not to mention the fact that he also owes the publisher of his book on Shakespeare, which he promised to write several years back and hasn't got around to, received an advance for it. He's got to pay that back. But also there's talk of him wanting to buy yet another house, making it a total of 3, some in Herne Hill, I believe I'm right in saying. And the locals apparently aren't all that keen on the idea because they think his presence might devalue the price of their property.
Perish the thought. We are getting a bit of a break-up on the signal, Peter, for the moment, but thank you for that, and we await the next instalment as ever. Peter, thanks very much indeed. You're watching GB News Live with me, Mark Longhurst, back in the chair for you. Don't go anywhere because plenty more to come in this next few hours, but we'll take a short break for you right now.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deems & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online, this is GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel. Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Good afternoon from the GB newsroom at 1 minute past 1. I'm Tamsin Roberts with the latest. The Home Secretary says yesterday was a dark day for British policing after a Met police officer admitted multiple sexual offences. David Carrick has pleaded guilty to 49 offences, including dozens of rapes and sexual offences over an 18-year period. Today, he's been sacked by the force at a misconduct hearing held in his absence. Suella Braverman says the standards and culture in the police service must change.
This case will rightly throw a spotlight once again on women's safety. No one should suffer abuse or feel frightened or harassed, whether they are at home, out and about, or online. We are taking concerted action to prevent violence against women, support victims and survivors, relentlessly pursue perpetrators and strengthen the system as a whole.
Dozens of people have been injured after a double-decker bus overturned in Somerset. The bus carrying 70 workers to the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station was involved in a collision with a motorcyclist this morning. Avon and Somerset police are urging people to only travel if essential due to the icy and freezing weather conditions. Inspector Rebecca Wells-Cole gave further details of the incident.
Emergency services have been on the scene since receiving the first 999 call, and we can confirm there have been no fatalities at this time. 54 patients were triaged at the scene, and it's too soon to confirm if any of these patients have life-threatening injuries. However, 26 patients are being treated as walking wounded.
New figures show that wages have failed to keep up with soaring prices, more so than at any point since records began. Average pay rose by 6.4% in the previous quarter, but when taking inflation into account, it means real-term pay dropped by 2.6%. The Office for National Statistics also says the unemployment rate rose by 0.2% to reach 3.7% over the same period. In response, the Chancellor says the labour market remains resilient and the best way to help people's wages go further is to stick to plans to halve inflation this year. Economist Jack Kennedy told GB News the trends that we can expect to see this year.
We are starting to see employers responding a little bit to the uncertain economic climate and sort of easing off the accelerator in terms of demand for full-time staff. But certainly, a lot of employers are trying to still fill staffing gaps. So certainly turning to part-time staff.
The Scottish Conservative leader has backed the UK government's move to block Holyrood's controversial gender bill reforms. Douglas Ross says the legislation seriously damages the rights of women. It's the first time Westminster has made an order under the Scotland Act to prevent a law from Holyrood going to royal assent. The First Minister of Scotland has called Westminster's decision a full frontal attack on the Scottish Parliament. MPs have voted in favour of anti-strike laws, with unions opposing the legislation. The strikes bill would see workers having to provide minimum levels of service during industrial action. It means bosses would be able to sack employees legally who choose not to work on strike days. Meanwhile, the ASLEF union says its train drivers will strike next month after their union rejected a pay offer. They'll strike on the 1st and 3rd of February, which will coincide with a walkout by 100,000 civil servants in their dispute over pay and jobs. Other upcoming industrial action includes a strike by the Royal College of Nursing and teachers. The Foreign Secretary is holding talks shortly with counterparts in Canada and also in the States with Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. He'll be urging them to help support Ukraine. We'll have more on this story a bit later on. That's all from me for now. Now it's back to Mark.
Tamsin, thanks very much indeed, and welcome back to GB News Live with me, Mark Longhurst, back in the chair for you. Coming up this hour, the Home Secretary has in the past half an hour expressed her sympathy for the victims of David Carrick, the Met Police officer guilty of serial rape over 2 decades. Suella Braverman said the Met Police had to do more to root out officers who broke the law. Carrick admitted a series of sexual offences against 12 women and was officially sacked from the force this morning. We'll be live at the scene of the bus crash involving those key workers at the Hinkley Point nuclear power station in Somerset. More than 40 on board the double-decker after it overturned following collision with a motorbike in icy conditions. Many treated at the scene, but it's feared 3 may have suffered significant injuries. Police in the West Country saying there were more than 100 reported accidents in a period of a matter of hours after the coldest night of the year so far. Are we heading for a constitutional conflict between Holyrood and Westminster? Nicola Sturgeon warning the UK government against blocking gender legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament, accusing ministers of using trans people as a political weapon. We'll have the latest on the row at the heart of Scottish devolution. Train drivers across the UK to strike yet again at the start of next month after rejecting the latest pay offers from rail companies. And meanwhile, the National Education Union announcing yesterday that teachers will strike over pay in England and Wales on 7 dates in February and March. The Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, branding the move bitterly disappointing, but she has pledged to hold talks with unions over the course of this week. But just when will all this industrial unrest end? But some good economic news for you. Wages growing at the fastest rate in more than 20 years. Average pay, excluding bonuses, rising by 6.4% between September and November. That's compared with the same period last year, but still not keeping pace with rising prices. So we'll assess the latest snapshot of the UK economy. Any signs of those long-awaited green shoots? And get in touch, of course, gbviews at gbnews.uk for your take on all of today's top stories. So David Carrick, who pleaded guilty yesterday to 71 sex crimes, has now been sacked by the Metropolitan Police. The misconduct hearing was held in his absence in West London. Well, the sex crimes include 24 counts of rape. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said in a cabinet meeting this morning that telling ministers everyone would have been appalled by the crimes of David Carrick, going on to say that the case undermined public confidence in the police, essential for them to do their jobs. But Downing Street has declined to say whether Rishi Sunak will be meeting the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. Let's get the latest with our national reporter Paul Hawkins, who's in southwest London and was at that hearing to hear the details. It's extraordinary, isn't it, Paul, that these matters slipped through all the vetting procedures and numerous reports, of course, about his behaviour. And Suella Braverman in this past half hour in the Commons indicating that really it's just not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we go back to the summer of 2021, following the murder of Sarah Everard, the Met Police at the time was saying, look, we can, saying to the women in the capital, we can protect you. We understand that Wayne Couzens, who murdered Sarah Everard, was one of our own, but we will double down on making sure we root out these kind of people. And at the same time, the Met Police have admitted that their own professional standards department failed to look into the background of David Carrick, who was a serving police officer and was facing an allegation of rape. Now, that allegation was withdrawn, but another woman made another allegation of rape. He was subsequently charged, and then the whole case unravelled. And so the problem is that the Met Police, they can say that we're doubling down and we are committed, you can trust us, to protecting women. But then that's happening while they're saying it. And so that is why we're looking at far more fundamental reform of the police. And that is why Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, said this in the Commons in the past half an hour.
Thousands of decent, hard-working police officers perform their duties with the utmost professionalism. They feel pride in putting on their uniform and want only the best for the communities that they serve. I know that they will share our collective disgust that a fellow officer could be responsible for such a despicable betrayal of everything that they stand for. Much of the impetus for change must come from within policing, but this government will continue leading from the front. As I've been clear, we are bringing forward part 2 of the Angelini inquiry to make recommendations on how forces can improve culture and tackle the root causes of police criminality and misconduct.
So part 2 of the Dame Angelini inquiry into the red flags that were missed over Wayne Couzens has been brought forward, but the Home Secretary didn't indicate whether an inquiry into David Carrick would be brought under that umbrella, whether that inquiry by Dame Angelini would be extended, or whether there would be a separate public inquiry into how David Carrick evaded kind of police detection, if you will. And that's something that Baroness Casey has recommended. She's looking into the standards and culture within the Met, and she's due to report in March. And actually, just something very quickly, Mark, that Mark Rowley, the Met Police Chief, has said this morning. He's hinted at radical, powerful change, saying the force's leadership, culture and practices are all up for grabs as he awaits the outcome of that report by Baroness Casey in March, which he expects to agree with. And he was also asked, just finally, he was asked, is it time to reconfigure the Met Police, similar to the way the Royal Ulster Constabulary became the police service for Northern Ireland? And he did not dismiss the idea.
OK, and Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, of course, observing there in the Commons that past half hour, still no legal requirements on how the vetting procedures take place, which some people may find absolutely extraordinary. But, Paul, thank you very much for updating us. More reaction, of course, as we get it. Now, teachers set to strike, the latest in this industrial tale of woe this winter and perhaps even heading into spring, to strike over pay in England and Wales, with the National Education Union announcing 7 dates for the strikes. There'll be national stoppages on the 1st of February, then the 15th and 16th of March. Meanwhile, teachers in Wales striking on the 14th of February. On the 28th, schools in the north will strike. Additionally, teachers in East and West Midlands coming out of the classroom on the 1st of March. The 2nd of March, those in London and the South East regions stopping work. Let's get more with our national reporter, Ellie Costello, who's outside the National Education Union headquarters in London. With all those dates and stoppages, Ellie, it's like a bit of a maths question in an exam, isn't it? When will your teacher be walking out?
Yes, absolutely, Mark. Good afternoon to you. The industrial unrest does continue. This time it's the turn of the teachers. 90% of teacher members voted to go out on strike. That result yesterday evening, 7 days of strikes planned across February and March. Well, I'm pleased to say that I'm joined now by Kevin Courtney, who is the Joint General Secretary of the NEU. Kevin, we just spoke there about 90% yes vote from the teachers, but only a 53% turnout. The government saying you've only just scraped this, the legal requirement being 50%. What do you say to that?
This is a simply overwhelming endorsement of our campaign. It's the biggest result by any trades union since the government brought in this law about thresholds. The government is making a really big mistake if they think this isn't well supported. It's massively supported by our members. And the reason that teachers are supporting this sort of campaign is that they know there's a crisis in our schools. We put out some figures today. Over a quarter of physics lessons are being taught by somebody who doesn't have a degree or a postgraduate qualification in physics, a PGC in physics. 1 in 6 chemistry lessons, almost a half of computing lessons, 20% of D&T lessons, 10% of geography lessons, 10% of maths teachers. There's a real crisis in our schools because we can't recruit and then keep teachers in our schools, and pay is part of the answer to that.
So you're saying this isn't just about pay, this is about recruitment and retainment, which of course is really important. Teachers have had a 5% pay rise in 2022, but I believe that comes from existing school budgets, isn't it?
Well, our problem with that 5% is the government keeps saying, it's the biggest pay rise we've had for 30 years. It's the biggest number, but it's the biggest gap with inflation. So it's actually the biggest pay cut that teachers have had. And last week, the IFS, the reputable Institute for Fiscal Studies, told the government that there's been a long-term decline in teacher pay compared with other pay in the economy, and they said that's an explanation of the teacher recruitment difficulties. Yesterday, the NFER, the National Foundation for Education Research, said the same thing. So the government is getting this message not just from our members, 9 out of 10 of them voting, but all these other bodies. There's a real crisis in education which is disrupting children's education every day.
And what about the teachers that are going on strike who are disrupting children's education? If you are a GCSE pupil in this country, you have only had 1 year of undisrupted learning. They will be hugely concerned about their upcoming exams, and there will be parents at home who are quaking in their boots at the thought of homeschooling again. What do you say to them?
We absolutely do not want to disrupt education. We do not want to go on strike. It is genuinely a last resort because the government isn't listening to us. The only reason the government is talking to us is because of the threat of strike action, and our action is aimed at reducing disruption in education. You talk about GCSE students, and it's an important point, but I was talking to a parent this week, a year 11 son doing GCSE chemistry. All the chemistry teachers have left the school. He's learning from a textbook with a teacher who has no qualification in chemistry. That's just a real reduction in the quality of education. And it's a reduction you can escape if you've got enough money. You can leave and join a private school, or you can get a home tutor for your child who has got a qualification in chemistry. But most families don't have access to that. So we are trying to reduce the level of disruption in education and lead to a more equal education system.
Kevin Courtney, Joint General Secretary of the NEU. Really good to have you with us on GB News. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Well, there you go, Mark. This isn't just an issue on pay. 5% pay rise for teachers in 2022. As you just heard there from Kevin Courtney, the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. He says this is about ensuring good quality education for children who cannot afford to go to private schools. And currently that 5% pay rise is coming out of pre-existing school budgets. It means for pupils, they might have fewer classroom assistants, perhaps fewer school trips. They are looking for not just pay, but better retention and better recruitment for teachers in this country. That's why they've announced these 7 days of strikes, 3 national dates, and there are also regional ones in there too. But it's very important to say the NEU say that only 4 of those dates will affect any one school. It won't be the full 7. But there you go, Mark. The teachers, the latest in a very long line of public sector workers who are walking out this winter over paying conditions.
Indeed, and of course the Education Secretary saying she cannot guarantee that all those schools will be kept open during that period, but we'll see what happens in terms of staff cover and so on. Ellie, thanks very much for updating us there with the union's place in that continuing disruption and industrial unrest. Now, a double-decker bus carrying some 70 people overturned in Somerset this morning following a collision with a motorcycle in icy conditions at 6 a.m. Thankfully, no one was killed, but there are reports that 3 may have suffered significant injuries. Well, footage posted from the scene on social media coming up. Viewers may find some of the scenes disturbing and showing the immediate aftermath of that crash. Well, passengers apparently banging on the windows with people scrambling to help to get them released. Police saying a significant number of emergency vehicles then on the scene in a major incident. A spokesperson for Hinkley Point C nuclear power station saying the bus had been carrying members of the workforce on the A39 when it overturned early this morning. Let's get more at the scene now with our reporter Jeff Moody, who's been following the story. And Jeff, just to reiterate, I mean, unofficial, I think it's coming from a local MP suggesting 3 may have been significantly hurt in this, but we've got no confirmation of that as yet.
Yes, that's quite correct. Police aren't going into any details about the injuries. They're saying that most of the injuries aren't life-threatening or life-changing, but that's as far as we know. They're also not telling us what caused the crash, but we do know that it involved a motorcycle as well. I was talking earlier on, Mark, to a dog walker that uses this route regularly, and he said to me, it's been an accident waiting to happen for some time here, as when there's a lot of heavy rain, the waters come down from the Quantock Hills onto the A39 here, and at 6 o'clock this morning that water would have been very icy indeed. Well, around an hour ago, a spokesman for Avon and Somerset Police came down to the scene and gave us this statement.
At 6 a.m. today, Tuesday the 17th of January, we were called to the A39 Quantock Road in Bridgewater following a report of a road-related incident involving a double-decker bus and a motorcyclist. We can now confirm the double-decker bus was carrying 70 Hinkley Point C workers and the bus driver when it overturned. Emergency services have been on the scene since receiving the first 999 call, and we can confirm there have been no fatalities at this time. 54 patients were triaged at the scene, and it's too soon to confirm if any of these patients have life-threatening injuries. However, 26 patients are being treated as walking wounded. A number of those treated at the scene have been taken to Musgrove Park Hospital, Bridgewater Minor Injury Unit and Southmead Hospital. It may take us some time to recover the bus and to clear the debris from the road.
Well, a recovery vehicle has just arrived here on the site, and they will be moving onto the scene shortly in order to take away the bus for closer examination. Hinkley Point have said that they are now in contact with all of the friends and the relatives of the people that have been injured. They're also offering counselling to their workers. They say that health and security is extremely important to them, not just on site, but on the workers' way to the site too. They're saying that Hinkley Point is still open for business this morning. Work continues on building that plant. That's the only news they've got as to how many people have been involved. They don't know yet how serious those injuries are.
And Jeff, just to sort of update people on the picture, I think Avon and Somerset Police were saying they had reported some 100 accidents across the region in a matter of 5 hours. And I think further down in Cornwall, of course, schools still shut after significant snowfall down there.
Well, that's right. They were saying there are so many incidents between 6 o'clock last night and 10 o'clock last night. There are a record number of calls to Avon and Somerset Police of icy roads. We've had a lot of rain over the last few days, a deluge of rain in places, and that has caused extreme problems when it comes to icy roads first thing in the morning.
Jeff, thanks very much indeed for updating us at the scene. And, of course, we'll update people when we get more on those reports of any injuries. Thanks very much indeed. Coming up, we'll be heading to Downing Street and Holyrood for the latest on the Scottish gender bill row. It's actually now a constitutional row. But before that, we'll take a short break for you.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you. Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News.
Frank,
fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. The UK government to stop a new law that could see the age of consent lowered to 16 when people apply to change their gender in Scotland. Now, that bill originally passed in December, backed the self-identification process, also removing the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Well, let's get more now from Downing Street with our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, the problem that's arisen is that Alistair Burt, the Scottish Secretary, basically saying that this then has a direct effect on equality law for the rest of UK. And this is the central question, of course, of devolution, that if this legislation is passed in Scotland and then has a direct effect on the parts of the UK, we've got Holyrood and Westminster at loggerheads.
Yeah, indeed. We've never been in this situation before, but you're right, it gets to the heart of some of the big questions about what power lies in the United Kingdom. And ultimately, the answer to that question is it resides fundamentally at Westminster. The UK Parliament remains supreme in spite or despite of devolution. At the end of the day, the Scottish Parliament has got more powers than any other devolved parliament, I think, in the world, but it is a devolved parliament and it is not and cannot challenge the supremacy of Westminster. And that is why the UK government are making the case that irrespective of the details of this bill that's passed in the Scottish Parliament, must be said by an overwhelming majority, the Gender Recognition Act, that in the end they feel that cuts across the Equalities Act that is based across the United Kingdom, was passed back in 2010, and that is why they think legally they're in a strong case here to suggest that this act cannot become law in Scotland. Now, Nicola Sturgeon, I think, who has described this as a full frontal attack, if you like, on the Scottish Parliament and indeed on Scottish politics, has got kind of two options here. Either she can do what the British government are now suggesting, which is to amend the legislation so that it does fit in with the Equalities Act, or she can take this down the legal process and challenge the UK government in courts. Now, it seems like she's probably going to do the latter. Why is that? Well, she will argue this is about signifying and trying to put down a line in the sand about the role the Scottish Parliament plays in terms of making Scottish law. But second of all, politically, is it advantageous for the SNP to take advantage of this situation and suggest that this is another sign of Westminster trampling over kind of Scotland's place within the UK and its ability to make its own laws? You bet it does.
Yeah.
However, it must be said that looking at opinion polls, Mark, there are suggestions that lots of people in Scotland aren't terribly fussed on this law in the first place. And second of all, in the legal terms, we'll have to see how this potentially plays out in court, the Scottish Government could lose that argument very easily.
Yeah, however, I mean, I guess there are those in Downing Street behind you assessing, is this the time to pick this fight? It's a bit of a gift politically to Nicola Sturgeon.
Indeed, and there are the politics to all of this. I mean, I think there are three aspects of this story. First of all, there's the details of the legislation itself and whether something like this, that gender recognition law in Scotland, or Act, sorry, should become potentially something that the rest of the UK should look at. Now, it's something the Conservative Party have said they're not prepared to do so. Labour have looked at it and even though their MSPs in Scotland voted for this legislation, Keir Starmer has said that he thinks that age of 16, that you're able to essentially change your gender at the age of 16, is too young. So there is that aspect of all that, and that's the argument around that particular piece of legislation. Then there's the argument, as you say, about the legality of all of this. The UK government feel it's got the right on this and that it needs to act, or else you end up in a constitutional situation where UK law is being undermined. Yeah. And then you're right, there's a third aspect to all of this, which is the politics of it, which is, i.e., how much are the SNP potentially going to take advantage of this, and how much will it play into Scottish public opinion and that wider question of independence. So when you've got all those mechanisms at play, it's a very, very complicated situation, and the UK government is going to have to thread very carefully here to keep essentially all sides kind of relatively happy, and that is no easy task, Mark.
With a lot else on its plate at the moment as well. Darren, for the moment in Downing Street, thank you for that. But let's head up to Holyrood and get the latest there from our GB News Scotland reporter, Tony Maguire, outside the Scottish Parliament. And, Tony, an indication, of course, that perhaps Nicola Sturgeon is going to dig in on this, calling it an attack on Scottish democracy.
Yes, very strong language from Nicola Sturgeon this morning, and certainly, obviously, this story is dominating the press cycle up in Scotland today. What we are seeing is that the Gender Recognition Reform Bill was vetoed essentially by Westminster because of the conflict between the devolved, I've lost my place here, because of the devolved issue of gender, but then the reserved issue of equality. So I'm joined now by Scottish Conservative MSP for the North East, Tess White. Tess, what is the opinion within the Scottish Conservative Party today?
Well, we're the only party that actually allowed our MSPs a free vote. It was such an important bill. The other parties whipped their members of Parliament to vote in a particular way, which we think is wrong. For something like this, it's very, very important that people can actually express their own views and make their own decisions about it, not to have party whips. And the other thing about the other parties, that particularly, Labour, 2 Labour MSPs voted against the bill, 2 actually didn't vote at all, and they were chastised for doing so. And now at the weekend, Keir Starmer has actually said that he has concerns. So he had concerns, why didn't he raise them before? And then the SNP, we had 7 SNP MSPs who rebelled, and one of them, Ash Regan, was actually dismissed from had to resign from her job, which is just not acceptable.
And obviously we heard there Nicola Sturgeon has called this an attack on democracy. Quite strong words coming out of the SNP camp today. In contrast, we haven't heard a whole lot from Anna Sarwar and Scottish Labour. Is Anna Sarwar struggling to cobble together a united front for Scottish Labour?
Yeah, Tony, if I can just talk about Nicola Sturgeon first, and then I'll address Anna Sarwar. So Nicola Sturgeon will use any trick in the book or out of the book for a constitutional grievance. This is a constitutional grievance. It shouldn't be a political issue. This is a very, very important bill, and she's using it as an attack on the UK government. Anna Sarwar, his party, are clearly divided, massive disarray, disruption, particularly bearing in mind what Keir Starmer has said on the Sunday television. So they have major divisions and concerns.
Fantastic. Well, Tess, thank you very much for your input today. This story isn't going anywhere, and I dare say that we'll hear more from Westminster and Holyrood in the days to come.
Indeed, Tony, thank you for that. As you're indicating, it's a pretty complex picture, but thanks for updating us there at Holyrood. And just to update you, in fact, that we are expecting to hear from the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, in the Commons fairly shortly. We'll update you on that as we get it. Also coming up after a news update, James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary in Washington, pushing the US government to follow the UK's footsteps and send more tanks to Ukraine. And we're breaking down the latest employment and pay figures coming through. Is it good or bad news for the UK's economy?
Good afternoon from the GB Newsroom at 1:33. Here are the headlines. The Home Secretary says yesterday was a dark day for British policing after a former Met Police officer admitted multiple sexual offences. David Carrick has pleaded guilty to 49 offences, including dozens of rapes and sexual offences over an 18-year period. Today, he was sacked by the force at a misconduct hearing held in his absence. Speaking in the Commons, Suella Braverman said the standards and culture in the police service must change.
This case will rightly throw a spotlight once again on women's safety. No one should suffer abuse or feel frightened or harassed, whether they are at home, out and about, or online. We are taking concerted action to prevent violence against women, support victims and survivors, relentlessly pursue perpetrators and strengthen the system as a whole.
Dozens of people have been injured after a double-decker bus overturned in Somerset. The bus carrying 70 workers to the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station was involved in a collision with a motorcyclist this morning. Avon and Somerset Police are urging people to only travel if essential due to the icy and freezing weather conditions. New figures show that wages have failed to keep up with soaring prices, more so than at any point since records began. The Office for National Statistics also says the unemployment rate rose by 0.2% to reach 3.7% over the same period. But the Chancellor says the labour market remains resilient. The Scottish Conservative leader has backed the UK government's move to block Holyrood's controversial gender bill reforms. Douglas Ross says the legislation seriously damages the rights of women. It's the first time Westminster has made an order under the Scotland Act to prevent a law from Holyrood going to royal assent. The First Minister has called Westminster's decision a full frontal attack on the Scottish Parliament. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you. Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to GB News Live. Let's update you on the state of the UK economy. No, it's not all bad news. UK unemployment actually rose to 3.7% from 3.5% in the 3 months leading up to November, according to the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics. But wages in the UK have also been rising at their fastest rate in more than 20 years, although in real terms, that pay still falling effectively because earnings, of course, failing to keep up with the high inflation rate. Well, joining us now once more, our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money. So, Liam, yet again, lots of figures, but important because, of course, at the heart of all this industrial unrest and the toing and froing between the government and the unions is this rate of inflation, and are wages actually keeping up with that?
Exactly. So let's go through some of the numbers, Mark, because you say what we're talking about here isn't only what people are being paid, we're talking about the numbers that are going to determine one way or the other where the government, trade unions can get through the most strikes we've had in this country for 30 years. So I've got some graphics here. The numbers came out this morning. In between September and November 2022, Mark, pay increased 6.4% across the economy. That's compared to the same period, September to November, the year before. That's a big increase. It's the biggest rise in what we call nominal pay, pounds and pence. It's the same whether you include bonuses or not, by the way, because bonuses grew at exactly the same amount as well. That's the biggest rise since 2001. Now, controversially, maybe, if you split that pay increase into private sector pay, the 4/5 of us who work with companies, and public sector pay, teachers, nurses, and so on, private sector pay went up by 7.1%. More than average pay, and public sector pay went up just by 3.3%, less than average pay. And you can be sure that the teachers who have voted to strike will be making no reference to that number. I'd say in return, by the way, or some people would say in return, that public sector pay is still on average higher than private sector pay. It's just going up less slowly, and public sector workers tend to have much, much better conditions, holidays.
Pensions particularly.
Pensions, sick pay, and so on. But here's the real kicker, Mark. If we factor in that inflation number that you spoke about, there it is, September to November 2022 compared to the same period of the previous year, pay after inflation, it's not going up. It's going down by 3.4%. So if your pay is going up at 6.5%, which it is, but inflation's 10%, which it is, your real pay, your real take-home pay after inflation is going down. And that's the steepest fall in real wages, which is what counts, since 2009.
And this is the very point that all these unions are making, particularly on those public sector deals, of course, when they're going to the government saying, we know it's going to cost you a lot of money, but in terms of the take-home pay, what people have got in their pockets when they get home, you've got to give us more.
And the government pushes back by saying, yes, but if everybody gets an inflation-linked pay rise, then inflation keeps going up because the companies have to pay for it. The government has to get the tax revenue from the companies. They pass that on to us when they sell us goods and services in the shops and on the internet, and you get what we call a wage price spiral.
Absolutely, and up it goes. Now, you're telling us that a lot of people are suggesting that this inflation rate, and the government, of course, has been talking about this, will fall pretty dramatically after the rises that we've seen. As you were saying, we've got the official figures tomorrow.
Big number tomorrow, the December inflation number. That will really feed into these wage negotiations and the industrial disputes as well.
Now, you were saying that there might actually be a bit of relief for the government on this, that we might be back in single figures?
I think we are on a downward trend for inflation. I say that because in October, the figure, inflation, October 22 compared to October 2021, 11.1%. November, 10.7%. I think it will be below that, maybe even single digits in December, when that December number comes out tomorrow. I'm looking at the US. For inflation now, we had the number last week, was down at 6%. I'm looking at the fact that the pound has risen since October and November, which means that our imports are cheaper.
Particularly fuel.
Fuel. So for all and we can feel it. When we fill up our cars and vans, yes, diesel is still elevated, but petrol is a lot cheaper, and diesel is cheaper too. We can feel that our fuel bills, our utility bills, they're still sky high, but they are starting at least to abate. The cost of living crisis is not over, but the rate of increase of prices may now be starting to slow quite significantly.
I'm just going to make you cry. I've just got back from the States where I was filling up $3.10 a gallon.
That's because we are so heavily taxed on our oil and gas here in the UK. Just one other point I wanted to make, Mark. I really think this is an important story for GB News viewers and listeners. We've often reported on what's going on with the so-called green industrial revolution. The green industrial revolution is this idea, particularly promoted by Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, and indeed by Ben Houchen, who's the Tory mayor up there on Teesside. In Blythe, there was to be, we talked about it a lot on GB News, this kind of gigafactory making the sort of
batteries.
The centrepiece of UK battery making. This is battery making for cars, not regular car batteries, but electric cars. So replacing, these internal combustion engines. This was to be a £3.8 billion factory. They've had access to £100 million of government funding. Now, this startup Volt, we've learnt just this morning, it's actually gone into administration, Mark, and 300-odd staff have been made, quotes, redundant with immediate effect, which is a big blow for the people of Blyth. It's a proud manufacturing town.
Yeah.
It was very, very... There was a real sense of optimism of visited Blyth with this factory coming on stream. That may not now happen.
And the key would be that was going to feed into producing electric cars here in Britain. I mean, like the Teslas in the US, where half the car, effectively, is the battery.
The battery is heavy. You don't want to make the car if you have to ship the batteries.
Yeah.
Because then the economics goes out the window. It isn't viable. You want to make the cars near where the batteries are being made. That's what makes economic sense. So this would have been a boost for car making across the northeast, which, of course, has enjoyed considerable success over
Nissan,
recent
for instance,
years. Indeed, it's become one of the hearts of British car making. Now, I don't think all is lost, right? I don't think all is lost. This is a start-up. Often what happens with start-ups, and fingers and toes crossed, this is what happens this time, what often happens with start-ups is the original investors get bought out. Now, there was a deal here for new creditors, new investors were going to come in, but the original investors wouldn't have it, so it's going into administration. But companies can be rescued from administration. The assets are still there. The factory isn't built, but the plans are there. The permissions, a lot of them are in place.
Right.
All what we call the intellectual property and some of the goodwill is there. This could yet be raised from the ashes, and I sincerely hope it will be.
But those workers for the moment probably...
Those workers for the moment will be redundant with immediate effect. Them's the breaks, as a former Prime Minister said.
We remember it well, indeed. Liam, thank you for that, and we'll see what happens with that story, of course, as you say, tremendously important for the gig economy. Now, Ukraine set to be top of the agenda as the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, begins a two-day trip to the US and Canada. He's set to use the British pledge to persuade the Americans and Canadians to follow the UK lead by sending more tanks to Ukraine. He's expected to stress the need for the right battlefield tools to be given to Ukraine to allow them to actually win the war. Let's speak to our political reporter, Catherine Foster, joining us now. And Catherine, true to say, of course, that UK has taken the lead on this. And even though the US has provided those Patriot anti-aircraft missiles, they've still not really provided much in the way of tanks on the ground.
No, and the 14 Challenger 2 tanks that Rishi Sunak announced the UK was sending to Ukraine at the weekend, they are the first modern battle tanks to be sent to Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky has been asking for this sort of military help for some time. So Britain really is leading the way in this. And James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary, is on a mission in America, in the US and in Canada tomorrow to lead by example and encourage the US, Canada and other Western powers to really up their support of Ukraine. Of course, it will be a year next month since Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw, didn't we, at the weekend, the horrific scenes coming out of Dnipro when a residential tower block was attacked and 40 people died. Britain, as you say, do have a proud record. They're sending these 14 tanks. There's talk of other tanks. Poland is supposed to be sending tanks, but because they were made in Germany, there's been a delay because Germany has not signed them off, and they're still waiting for that. So James Cleverly said in a statement that the UK, the US and Canada always have each other's backs when it counts. And of course, this is something that Boris Johnson, previous but one Prime Minister, was very strong on, wasn't it? When Russia invaded Ukraine, the UK came to Ukraine's aid very, very quickly and really have championed them ever since. And speaking of Boris Johnson, he's reportedly going to be popping up at the World Economic Forum in Davos for a meeting about Ukraine on Thursday. He's also supposedly planning a trip to Ukraine, though Lord Dannatt, the ex-head of the British Army, has said basically please don't go, that will be counterproductive. But certainly Rishi Sunak wants to continue this very strong lead that the UK has taken on supporting Ukraine going forward.
But do we think that the Foreign Secretary may have a bit of an uphill battle in Washington, bearing in mind, of course, Republicans now with the Congress indicating that perhaps they are going to really question the amount of money being spent on the conflict in Ukraine?
Yes, this is a real worry, isn't it? As this conflict drags on, there is no sign of it ending anytime soon, unfortunately. That support for Ukraine will begin to diminish, will begin to fracture. And as you say, with the Democrats, and increasingly in the West, questions being asked about value for money. So certainly there will be a joint press conference later this afternoon. We will see the Foreign Secretary will be hoping for an announcement and positive news on that front, and then we will see.
Right, Catherine, we're just going to have to interrupt you there. Apologies for that, but we're going to go to the Commons because Alistair Jack, Scottish Secretary, just on his feet in this
Reform Scotland Bill from proceeding to royal assent. This order will mean the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament will not submit the bill for royal assent. This government believes, however, that transgender people deserve our respect, our support and our understanding. My decision is centred on the legislation's consequences for the operation of reserved matters, including equality legislation across Scotland, England and Wales. The Scottish Government's bill would introduce a new process for applying for legal gender recognition in Scotland. The changes include reducing the minimum age a person can apply for a gender recognition certificate from 18 to 16, and removing the need for a medical diagnosis and evidence of having lived for 2 years in their acquired gender. The bill would amend the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which legislated for a single gender recognition system across the United Kingdom and which received a legislative consent motion from the Scottish Parliament. The approach taken in the Scottish Government's Gender Recognition Reform Bill was the subject of intense debate in the Scottish Parliament. A number of significant amendments were tabled right up until the end of the bill's passage. And the Minister for Women and Equalities corresponded with and met with the Cabinet Secretary Shona Robertson to discuss the UK Government's concerns before the bill had reached its final stage. Mr. Speaker, I have not taken this decision lightly. The Government has looked closely at the potential impact of the bill, and I've considered all relevant policy and operational implications together with the Minister for Women and Equalities. And it is our assessment that the bill would have a serious adverse impact, among other things, on the operation of the Equality Act 2010. Those adverse effects include impacts on the operation of single-sex clubs, associations and schools, and protections such as equal pay. The Government shares the concerns of many members of the public and civic society groups regarding the potential impact of the bill on women and girls. The bill also risks creating significant complications from having two different gender recognition regimes in the UK and allowing more fraudulent or bad faith applications. The Government is today publishing a full statement of reasons alongside the order, which will set in full the adverse effects the Government is concerned about. Mr. Speaker, I would like to address the claims put forward by those who would seek to politicise this decision and claim that this is some kind of constitutional outrage. And you can hear them, Mr. Speaker, you can hear them. The Section 35 power was included in the Scotland Act, which established the Scottish Parliament. This is the first time the power has been exercised, and I acknowledge that this is a significant decision. The powers in Section 35 of the Scotland Act are not new, and this Government has not created them. They have existed as long as devolution itself. And we should be clear that the power was included in the Act by the architects of the devolution for a reason. Donald Dewar himself noted that the power struck an important balance. The Section 35 power provides a sensible measure to ensure that devolved legislation does not have adverse impacts on reserved matters, including on the equalities legislation, such as the Equality Act 2010. This is not about preventing the Scottish Parliament from legislating on devolved matters, but about ensuring that we do not have legal frameworks in one part of the United Kingdom which have adverse effects on reserved matters. And we should be clear that this is absolutely not about the United Kingdom Government being able to veto Scottish Parliament legislation whenever it chooses, as some have implied. The power can only be exercised on specific grounds, and the fact that this is the first time it has been necessary to exercise the power in almost 25 years of devolution emphasises that it is not a power to be used lightly. In the instance of the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill, I have concluded that the bill would have serious adverse effects on the operation of the Equality Act 2010. And as I've set out in my correspondence with the First Minister yesterday, I would prefer not to be in this situation. The United Kingdom Government does all we can to respect the devolution settlement and to resolve disputes. It is open to the Scottish Government to bring back an amended bill for reconsideration in the Scottish Parliament. So to conclude, Mr Speaker, I have set out to the Scottish Government that should they choose to do so, I hope we can work together to find a constructive way forward that both respects devolution and the operation of the United Kingdom Parliament legislation, and I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement? This is an incredibly serious moment. It's the first time Section 35 has been invoked. Donald Dewar has already been mentioned, the father of devolution, of course, designed Section 35 to protect devolution. It was passed by all parties in this House and hasn't been objected to since. It was intended not as a blocking mechanism, but an enabling mechanism, so that the Scottish Parliament could pass legislation and devolve competencies without changing reserved functions. There was concern at the time by colleagues of the Secretary of State that this could be used as a veto. So a memorandum of understanding was agreed. It said, and I quote, "Although the UK Government is prepared to use these powers if necessary, it sees them as very much a matter of last resort. The UK Government and the administration concerned will therefore aim to resolve any difficulties through discussion so as to avoid any action or omission by the devolved administration having an adverse impact on non-devolved matters." So can I ask the Secretary of State, is this a last resort? Has the Secretary of State had extensive discussions with the Scottish Government before taking this action? No. How many times has the Secretary of State met with the Scottish Government before the bill was passed, during its debate in Holyrood and since its passage? It appears to me that this has only become a last resort in terms of the legal timing because both governments can't and won't work with each other. Yeah. The Secretary of State says the Section 35 is being used, among other reasons, in relation to the Equality Act. Both the Scotland Act and the Equality Act are landmark pieces of Labour legislation, establishing devolution and enshrining rights to be free of discrimination in law. Nobody has to question this party's commitment to equality. We passed the initial GRA, we brought in the Disability Discrimination Act, and we got the world-leading Equality Act into law. But clearly, there's a need for laws passed by Holyrood and those by Westminster to interact. And in this case, the trans community need that cross-border interaction to work. Part of the reason that after 25 years of devolution, Section 35 has never been exercised is largely because of the way devolution was set up and intended to operate. Governments with their own agendas, but with a common purpose, working together to serve the Scottish people. Now Scotland is saddled with an administration in Edinburgh that's hell-bent on breaking devolution and a Conservative administration here in London that's intent on ignoring it. Indeed, the Secretary of State seems to spend more time with government lawyers to stop things happening rather than make them work, and the Scottish Government is spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on lawyers challenging laws they know are unchallengeable in order to manufacture political grievance. And in this case, it's the public who are let down. Trans people who suffer intense discrimination will now not see this legislation take effect anytime soon, if at all, and women's rights groups who will likely not see their concerns addressed or their fears alleviated because this simple truth is that this has turned into a constitutional bun fight. Yeah. I would also suggest that the SNP would be rightly screaming, and they are doing today and would do so in the past, if a piece of legislation passed in this place had implications for default competencies. They would challenge that, and they would rightly challenge that, as is their right. And if we are to accept the argument from the Scottish Government that there is no effect on the Equality Act, then the courts will surely strike out this Section 35 action, as we believe the Scottish Government will take it to court. Mr Speaker, can I also ask the Secretary of State, Scottish Labour got the primacy of the Equality Act on the face of the Gender Recognition Bill. Will the statutory instrument that he detailed in his statement give the details of where he thinks it is incompatible? Yes. The Secretary of State said last night there was a version of this Act which the UK Government could support. So what does that look like? But he says in his statement there are complications with two different gender regimes. Is he saying the Scottish Parliament shouldn't have the competence? As the bill was debated in Holyrood, was it not obvious to him and to his colleagues that it could contravene reserved law? What did he do about it then? During the passage of the bill, Scottish Labour made clear that if the bill was to work, clear guidance was required. The SNP Scottish Government said it was for the Equality and Human Rights Commission to provide such guidance, not them as the government. Why doesn't the Secretary of State instruct the EHRC to provide that guidance, look at the cross-border issues he mentions, and provide recommendations as to the interaction of the Equality Act? Both governments should commit to accepting those conclusions. Or is the Secretary of State saying that the ball is only in the Scottish Government's court to bring back amended legislation, and he now backs out of the process? Mr. Speaker, we support the principle of updating the GRA, which when the Labour government introduced in 2004 was world-leading, but 2 decades on now requires modernisation to humanise and to remove the indignities in this dreadful process. We've ended up in a legal and constitutional impasse. My final question to the Secretary of State is, what is he going to do to resolve it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, to answer his questions, hopefully in the right order, it is not a last resort. To understand the Scotland Act, the Section 33 is where the UK legislation is directly changed, and Section 35 is when it's adversely affected. And we have 28 days to make a decision in either case before the legislation goes for royal assent. And in this case, the legal test that has been given to us and proved by our officials is one of Section 35, which is adverse effect on on 2 parts of UK/GB legislation. So that's where we're at. We have 28 days to make that decision, and we have to make a decision in that time frame. And in this case, this very senior legal opinion advises us that a Section 35 is appropriate. And we will see that in my statement of reasons, which we have laid with the order. On his second point, officials have been meeting with officials in the Scottish Government since the bill was introduced, and the Minister for Gender and Equalities wrote, after the second stage, wrote to the Bill Minister expressing her concerns and asking for a meeting, and that meeting took place, and again, her concerns were expressed at that meeting. Regarding the EHRC, the EHRC have said that they're willing to work with and support the Scottish Government if they can. However, they make it very clear that their ongoing concerns are still on the record, and that's where that rests. And I think that addresses all the points that he raised. Well, but if any are not addressed, I'm sure others in the chamber will ask those questions.
Douglas Ross.
Secretary of State outlined in his statement how the UK Government has sought to constructively engage with the Scottish Government during the passage of this bill prior to it being voted on in the Scottish Parliament. Yet Nicola Sturgeon has now tried to turn this into a political battle between the Scottish and UK Government, when all, as I understand it, the Scottish Secretary and the Government are trying to do is protect women's rights. So despite the howls that we are getting from the SNP, can the Scottish Secretary confirm that all the SNP have to do is bring forward a bill in the Scottish Parliament that protects the rights of women and girls across the United Kingdom?
Yes, and actually I think that, Mr. Speaker, fortunately that addresses one of the points that the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland raised, and I can address that here. I mean, I have written to the First Minister, I've suggested that we meet to resolve these issues, and it is the case that the Scottish Government's bill has adverse effects on those 2 pieces of Scottish legislation. You will see it in the Statement of Reasons, which has been produced by our legal advisers. And what is missing is sufficient protections and safeguards for women and children that are reflected in existing Westminster legislation. And that is why I have had to lay this order.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Dr Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Vetoing this legislation is an unprecedented attack on the Scottish Parliament, which passed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill 86 to 39, including MSPs from every single party. Gender recognition is a devolved policy area, and this does not change the 2010 Equality Act or give any additional rights to those with a certificate. It shortens and simplifies the process, and particularly ends the requirement for a psychological diagnosis of gender dysphoria. This is in keeping with the guidance from the World Health Organization and UN, which recommends change to a legal statutory process based on self-identification. This change has already been made by many countries over the last decade, including neighbours Ireland, Belgium, Denmark. But this government is threatening to end UK acceptance of international certificates. I find it bizarre, considering the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, suggested a similar proposal in 2017. So can the Secretary of State explain exactly which parts of the Equality Act are changed by this bill? Why did he not raise specific concerns during the 2 consultations carried out by the Scottish Parliament, or in response to the Cabinet Secretary's letter in October, rather than a response that came 3 days before the final debate on the bill? What modifications is he suggesting to the bill that wouldn't include a return to the outmoded medicalised process? Why is he using one of the most marginalised groups in society to pick a fight with the Scottish Parliament? Is he seriously, after 300 years of different marriage ages and voting ages, suggesting there can no longer be legal or age differences north and south of the border? And does he recognise that vetoing this bill simply highlights the hollow reality of devolution?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady won't be surprised to hear that I don't recognise very much of what she said as being correct, and I would point her to the statement of reasons which will be laid alongside this order today, and our legal advice is very clear. The Equality Act 2010 is reserved, and there are adverse effects. And they will be there in the statement of reasons. And I listed some of those in my statement I made only moments ago. I listed them areas around associations, women's safe spaces, single-sex clubs, single-sex schools, etc., etc. It was very clear. It was very clear what I said, and you will see what legal counsel have determined when you see the statement of reasons.
Laura Ferris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A Conservative government standing up for women's sex-based rights in Scotland. I congratulate the government on this decision, which we know will protect women's sex-based specialist services in areas like rape crisis.
So, just to update you, these are the discussions at Westminster about the row that's erupted with Holyrood, of course, the Scottish Parliament, over transgender rights. And it actually touches at the heart of devolution and, as Nicola Sturgeon actually asserted, is, in her view, an attack on Scottish democracy. Well, let's go live to Downing Street and join our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, it's quite technical and involved in terms of the trans issue itself, but clearly what Alistair Jack is trying to set out is that this Section 35, a sort of nuclear button, if you like, in terms of the constitutional relationship between Scotland and England, is appropriate here after having taken what he said was legal advice from a senior legal counsel, i.e. they're not taking this lightly, as he said.
Yeah, I think the UK government is at pains to say 2 things. First of all, that they're not doing this in many regards to show that the UK Parliament is supreme and that it can slap down Scottish legislation at any point that it wants, though, of course, in theory, it can. This is the first time it's ever happened, though, since that devolution settlement back in 1998. So he's saying that we're not doing this just because we can, and we're also not doing this just because we dislike the legislation. Now, there are many within the Conservative Party who, frankly, do not like the legislation that is and has been voted on and passed overwhelmingly in the Scottish Parliament when it comes to gender recognition. Many feel it goes too far, and it's not just a view inside the Conservative Party. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, set out his objections at the weekend, saying he thought that 16, that's the age at which you, in theory, if this was to become law in Scotland, you could change your gender, was too young. And he's not saying it's not because we disagree with the legislation that we're doing this either, even though they do. It's because, as you say, he's taken legal advice from across government, and they believe that this cuts across the Equalities Act, the Equalities Law that is in place across the whole of the United Kingdom from 2010, and that is why they're suggesting to the Scottish Government, why don't you amend the legislation and we'll see if it can fit in with that Equalities Act, and then it will get royal assent. And also interestingly today, Alistair Jack announced something that we thought was going to happen, though has been talked about, it must be said, for a very long time from the Conservative government, in fact way back to Theresa May when she was Prime Minister, that they are going to now finally legislate when it comes to banning conversion therapy, that is for LGBT people. This idea that, you know, people can find themselves in a very vulnerable situation and be converted, if you like, to try and not be LGBT, something the government has promised it's going to ban for a very long time. They are going to choose that, but it is also going to be extended to trans people as well. And I think this is an attempt by the government to show that this is not them, in many ways, trying to take a position on the trans issue, that they are going to extend this, and that in the end this is all about the law and the legal advice the government have received. But yes, it is a very complicated situation, and it is one that plays into not just the ongoing debate about the rights of trans people and how that might impact the rights of other people, but it also, of course, impacts on Scottish Parliament and politics as well, in the sense that the SNP may well use this as an example, they would claim, of where Westminster's trampling on the independence and the authority of the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, the legal advice that they received, it seems to centre on these words, serious adverse impact. And he's talked about single-sex spaces, for instance, and the impact that it may have on women and girls, sort of bearing in mind the 2010 Equality Act. But as you pointed out, I mean, we heard from the SNP there at Westminster, using one of the most marginalised groups to pick a fight with Scotland. I mean, clearly they see an opportunity here to really sort of use this to ram home the case for Scottish independence.
Yeah, and that's why, Mark, I'm suggesting that's why the government are at pains today to say that this is not about this particular act in terms of the content of it. And in addition to that is why they've also announced the extension of this ban on conversion therapy to trans people, again to show that, in theory, they're not trying to pick on this kind of the rights of a small minority of people who clearly are very vulnerable. And there is a recognition, I think, politically at Westminster, across the board, that actually this issue does need to be looked at, that the current processes in place for trying to change your gender are not perfect and do need to change. But you're right, there is also a suspicion within the government, within politicians, again across the board at Westminster, that the SNP have actually picked on this particular issue to try and beat the government with, that they knew that this would potentially raise these legal issues, and that it is part of a wider campaign, their independence campaign, to try and make some political gain out of this when it comes to the Scottish independence question. So it's quite difficult to untangle, really, who is at play here, and, it's quite contentious, it's very difficult, these are very sensitive issues, and yet they've got massive wider constitutional issues about where power rests in the United Kingdom. And frankly, this is going to, be a big row that's going to carry on potentially into the courts. But ultimately, I think the big question in all of this is, where does Scottish public opinion lie? Because that can be crucial to everything. And there are polls suggesting that a majority of people in Scotland aren't in favour of this legislation, even though it was overwhelmingly backed by MSPs. And if that is the case, will they really be that concerned that Westminster has blocked it? I'm not entirely sure. I don't think the SNP's argument this is a constitutional crisis will necessarily echo quite in the same effect or in the same way that they hope it does.
Yeah, despite that vote, as we heard in Holyrood, of 86 to 39. But we shall see, to be continued, of course. Darren at Downing Street, thank you very much indeed for updating us there. Now, staying with the politics of the day, we heard from the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, in the Commons a little earlier, warning there could be more shocking cases involving police misconduct. She addressed the Commons after the David Carrick case, the 48-year-old former Met officer sacked earlier today after pleading guilty to dozens of rapes and sexual offences. Well, let's get more with our national reporter, Paul Hawkins, who's been following the case. And, Paul, clearly the proceedings this morning were pretty rapid compared to what's happened previously in terms of the vetting procedures he went through and all the complaints and so on, which had Yvette Cooper in the Commons questioning the whole basis of the vetting procedure, saying, you know, no legal requirements on how this vetting took place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes to the heart of where the police go from here now in terms of how they change the way their officers are vetted and the standards to which they should adhere. Look, just to explain the hearing earlier, it took just under 2 hours. David Carrick sacked from the Met. Metropolitan Police lawyer Hill Bennett calling Carrick's crimes a catastrophic effect on his victims and their families, describing his crimes as heinous, targeted and deliberate. He said policing has taken a step backward as a result of these convictions. And what goes to the heart of this is the way in which officers are vetted, because the Mets had to apologise to the victims of David Carrick because his name cropped up on 9 occasions during a 21-year period in relation to allegations of rape, domestic violence and harassment. And in fact, he passed police vetting during that time on 2 occasions. So earlier, as you mentioned, Mark, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, speaking in the Commons, said that the case would now be considered as part of the Angelini inquiry, which is looking into the Sarah Everard murder and how red flags were missed there over Wayne Cousins, a serving police officer who killed Sarah Everard. And so that will also now look at how David Carrick, how police missed the clues, the pattern of behaviour that was inherent in David Carrick in the lead up to his convictions. This is what Suella Braverman had to say in the Commons earlier.
Thousands of decent, hard-working police officers perform their duties with the utmost professionalism. They feel pride in putting on their uniform and want only the best for the communities that they serve. I know that they will share our collective disgust that a fellow officer could be responsible for such a despicable betrayal of everything that they stand for. Much of the impetus for change must come from within policing, but this government will continue leading from the front. As I've been clear, we are bringing forward part 2 of the Angelini inquiry to make recommendations on how forces can improve culture and tackle the root causes of police criminality and misconduct.
So that's what the Home Secretary had to say earlier. Labour called her statement weak and said, as you mentioned, Mark, that it would legislate to ensure that specific standards are met when it comes to police vetting.
I join the Home Secretary in giving tribute to the bravery of the victims who have come forward, but we have to face up to the further evidence that this case has brought up of appalling failures in the police vetting and misconduct processes that are still not being addressed by the government and are not being addressed in this statement. And I would say to the Home Secretary that given the scale of the problems, not just in this case, but in previous cases as well, her statement is very weak and it shows a serious lack of leadership on something that is so grave and affects confidence in policing as well as serious crimes.
So both Suella Braverman and Mark Rowley have warned that there could be more crimes uncovered by this Operation Onyx that's looking back at the decision-making process when it comes to vetting and reviewing files of serving officers and members of the Metropolitan Police staff at the moment. In terms of more fundamental change, we're waiting for that Baroness Casey report to come back in March. But Mark Rowley has already said that he will agree with the recommendations that she brings out. He's hinted at radical, powerful change, saying the force's leadership, culture and practices are all up for grabs. And when asked earlier if it's time to reconfigure the Met Police in the same way that the Royal Ulster Constabulary was reconfigured into the Northern Ireland Police Service, he didn't dismiss the idea but said he would wait for Baroness Casey's report.
Paul, thank you very much indeed for updating us on that. And, of course, we'll see what emerges in terms of those various reports. But let's speak now to Parm Sandhu, a former Met Police Chief Superintendent who joins us. Parm, thank you very much indeed for joining us once more. On the face of it, it would seem a fairly straightforward procedure for Smart Rowley when we learn from Yvette Cooper, of course, that there's no legal requirement on the vetting process and how that takes place. I mean, surely that's the number one thing. If you put that in place, that's when you start to get confidence on how the police are actually policed.
Good afternoon. Yes, you're right. The confidence and trust in policing has taken a huge nosedive. And what the issue here is, even though we're talking about vetting, it is different right across the country. And also the complaints departments are different right across the country. In my view, the solution is to take the investigation of police complaints outside of the Met and take the vetting outside of the Met, have an independent body that then looks at all of those issues together and is not police marking their own homework. And what has happened in the last few years, vetting has become a tick box exercise where the candidate has to state whether or not something untoward has happened. So the onus is on the candidate. And obviously, if you're going to have people like David Carrick, who are dishonest, rapists, sexual predators, they are not going to tell the truth about what they've been up to. So vetting is failing right across the country, but particularly in the Met. And it needs to be an independent group of people who are not police officers doing that work. And I think that's what's happened. Police marking their own homework, investigating each other is not going to work any longer.
Yeah, and of course the failure not just of the system, but perhaps the individuals who are actually doing that work. But on this question about the Met itself then, and we heard reference there to Police Service of Northern Ireland. I mean, do you believe that's the other thing that Sir Mark Rowley's going to have to address now? And that's dismantling the Met as it is at the moment and coming up with another police force for London?
There has to be something radical happen now to get that trust and confidence back, because my biggest worry is that there are going to be people out there, men and women, who are going to need police help. They may hesitate to pick the phone up and ask for that help because they'll be thinking, I might get a David Carrick type individual. So to restore that trust and confidence, something radical has to happen. And to restore the trust and confidence, it has to be either start again or take the complaints away so that people know they can trust the complaint side of it at least, so that if they have any allegations or concerns, they can raise them. But the culture of the Met in particular, enables these kinds of individuals to flourish because they can hide behind that label of banter, and that's what's gone wrong there.
We've heard from Sir Mark Rowley that there may be hundreds, perhaps more, who will be unmasked, if that's the right word, as a result of these various inquiries going on. Can I just ask you personally about your experiences and your experience at the Met and the sort of behaviour that you experienced at the time?
Mark, I've written a whole book about it. So I had some adverse experiences, and I have tried to raise my voice to try and make a difference for other individuals, because the majority of police officers are good, hard-working individuals. They want to be there, and they want to be there for the right reasons. David Carrick has not just let down the public, he's also let down his colleagues, and they are all really aware of that. But we've got to create safe environments so that people can raise their heads and say, I'm concerned about the behaviour of my colleague, instead of then being demonised and becoming victims themselves, which is what normally happens.
Parm, thank you very much indeed for joining us and bringing us your assessment once more. Thanks for your time. Now, let's turn to this awful crash this morning, the double-decker bus carrying around 70 people, which collided with a motorcyclist at Bridgewater, Somerset, in icy conditions about 6 o'clock this morning. Passengers were treated at the scene after the double-decker overturned, taking the workers to the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station. Well, footage from the scene posted on social media, which some viewers may find disturbing, we have to warn you, show the immediate aftermath of that crash. Well, you can hear their passengers inside banging on the windows, trying to get out of the vehicle, and people at the scene trying to help them. A major incident then declared with all the emergency services after this crash on the A39. Well, let's get the latest now with our reporter, Jeff Moody, who is there. Jeff, thankfully no fatalities after that awful accident, which we were all, of course, very thankful for. But indications still unofficial, but the MP there talking about perhaps 3 people with quite severe injuries after this crash.
Yes, that's right. We don't know whether those injuries are life-threatening or life-changing at this stage, but we are being told that they are quite serious. The recovery vehicle has arrived in the last 5 minutes. It's just gone into the scene where the task will be to get the double-decker bus upright again. When I got here this morning at about 10:30, Mark, the road was strewn with people's belongings. There were bags and coats and jackets all over the road. The police have now removed those and taken them away for examination, and they're hoping now in the next sort of 10 minutes or so to be able to get that bus upright so that they can move that off road, open the road again, and look in greater detail at the bus to see whether they can work out exactly what happened here. The police aren't telling us anything about what happened. We assume that it slipped on the icy roads. A lot of water comes down from the Quantock Hills when there's been heavy rain, and we believe that at 6 o'clock this morning that water would have been strewn across the road and it would have been particularly icy. The police, Somerset and Avon police, said this morning in a statement that 70 Hinkley Point workers plus the driver were involved in the accident, but because there's been no loss of life as yet, they're saying this is no longer a serious incident, no fatalities, but 54 were triaged at the scene. 26 of those 54 were just walking wounded. We're hearing that there were some fractures, some people broke their arms, but apart from that, nothing particularly life-threatening at this stage. Hinkley Point has issued a statement in the last couple of hours. They say that they take safety extremely seriously, whether that be safety at the site itself or safety on the way to work, and they're saying that they're now liaising with the families to try and to bring some sort of comfort to them. Let's have a listen to what they had to say to me a little earlier on.
Our focus is for supporting everyone who's been involved in this incident and providing that support and advice wherever necessary. We're continuing that construction and working with the highways team here in Somerset and the police. Soon this road will be reopened and we can commence our normal operations once again.
Well, a few moments ago, I was speaking to a neighbour that actually heard the crash itself at 6 o'clock this morning. She said that the emergency services were here pretty promptly. They were here by around 6:15. There was an air ambulance on site, and we've also been seeing police helicopters over the scene as well as the morning develops. But that's it from me for now, but we'll have more updates live as they happen here on GB News.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you very much indeed. Of course, back to you perhaps when that vehicle is upright and they start those investigations. For the moment, thank you very much indeed for updating us. You're watching GB News Live. Also coming up, the latest on the strikes. Teachers now preparing to walk out across England and Wales. And online safety. Social media bosses could face jail now if they fail to protect children from online harm. Let's take a short break first.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here. You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Let's just update you with some breaking news here on GB News Live. We're just getting reports that 2 people have been stabbed outside a tube station at Harlesden in West London. The station now closed, parts of the London Underground suspended after what's described as a double stabbing. Ambulance service saying they were called to the station at around 20 to 1 following reports of an injured man there. No more details at the moment, but of course we'll update you as we get more on that. The latest in a number of knife crimes, of course, in the capital in recent weeks and months. Now, in a government apparent climb down, the Prime Minister and the Culture Secretary have agreed to toughen up punishments for social media bosses who fail to protect children from damaging content online, preventing in that way a backbench rebellion over what's called the Online Safety Bill. Well, in a statement to MPs, the Culture Secretary Michelle Donnellan said that the government would amend the Online Safety Bill so that senior managers who, quote, have consented or connived in ignoring enforceable requirements, risking serious harm to children, face criminal penalties. Well, the government will also take action to tackle the so-called TikTok traffickers who use social media to advertise small boat crossings for Channel migrants. Let's speak now to Judy Thomas, whose 15-year-old daughter, Frankie, took her own life back in 2018 after viewing harmful material after several months, now working with schools to strengthen online safety measures. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on GB News. We appreciate your time. I think I'm right in saying that the inquest at the time identified the failings of the school, which has now increased its online safety measures, but it didn't address the issue of the social media providers themselves.
It did actually. It's part of what contributed, according to the coroner, to Frankie taking her own life was not only the failures at the school, which is really good. They've sorted that. It's very safe now.
Yeah.
But also the platform that she accessed, which I'm not going to name. It wasn't very well known. That she did address that, and she did mention it in her conclusions that had also contributed to what. Because just to say quickly, the stories that Frankie accessed on that site, the last 4 out of 5 had suicides in them, which, without that word in the title or the content, but it glorified suicide. The last one had 2 suicides in, and the coroner said that, well, she copied the last one at home later that day.
Yeah,
she did mention that they are not a UK-based site, so they were not compelled to come to the inquest and gave pretty not much input into it, frankly.
Yeah, and therein lies the difficulty, of course. You know, it is literally the World Wide Web, and therefore the accountability issue is very difficult. So, given now that the government appears to have acknowledged the concern on the backbenches in toughening up the procedures, will the fact that the power would be there to make individuals accountable change this approach, do you believe?
It might go somewhere towards it. I hope so. I don't wish to be emotive. That's not helpful. But I have written to all the sites that Frankie accessed also earlier in the year on her school laptop at school, which were appalling when she was only 14. And in all of my letters, both to them and to, well, whoever, minister and everything, I've said, God forbid this should ever happen to you. I'm not being a big self-pitying whatever, But actually, people think, oh, this is so sad, and I don't blame them, because I wouldn't get it unless it had happened to me, and I wouldn't want it to happen to anybody else. But and I'm sorry to say, when you actually come across your daughter, who's our only child, dead, just like that, it changes everything. It is permanent.
Yeah.
It changes the family forever. And I'm not going to focus on that. I'm so sorry, but just to say,
yeah,
if it goes towards any, perhaps, I'm not judging them, but complacency or casual thing, because they can't get it. They can't get it. And I wouldn't want them to have to, in a sense, for themselves. But if it did happen to anybody in that situation, whether they're running the sites or whatever, I'm pretty sure it would change very quickly. So, yes.
I can well imagine. But just to maybe just bring one positive aspect in, you do believe, however, that schools, education systems have taken note and have accepted that point, that they acknowledge what it would do to an individual once this happens?
We are working with schools, with the Department for Education in particular, because the school had no idea that their filtering and monitoring systems weren't connected properly and working, which is why Frankie was able to access all of that. And so we are trying to get mandatory requirements for schools to check these things regularly, because if they had checked, and we're not naming the school because we're not interested in blaming the school, it doesn't bring Frankie back. But what we want is for it to stop other children accessing stuff wherever, in this case schools, just because they hadn't realised they need to strengthen. It shouldn't be just advice, but you must do this, because this is what the coroner pointed out had played a big part in Frankie being able to access that stuff.
Judy, we do appreciate you talking to us and taking the time to go through the issues again. And, of course, let's hope that online safety bill does indeed strengthen things and give perhaps more parents the protection and their children that they need. Thank you very much for your time. Time to get an update now on the news. Tamsin's waiting for us.
Mark, thank you. It's 2:35. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. The Home Secretary says yesterday was a dark day for British policing after a former Met Police officer admitted multiple sex offences. David Carrick has pleaded guilty to 49 offences, including dozens of rapes and sexual offences over an 18-year period. Today, he was sacked by the force at a misconduct hearing held in his absence. Speaking in the House of Commons, Suella Braverman says the standards and culture in the police service must change.
This case will rightly throw a spotlight once again on women's safety. No one should suffer abuse or feel frightened or harassed, whether they are at home, out and about, or online. We are taking concerted action to prevent violence against women, support victims and survivors, relentlessly pursue perpetrators and strengthen the system as a whole.
The Scottish Secretary has backed the UK government's move to block Holyrood's controversial gender bill reforms. It's the first time Westminster has made an order under the Scotland Act to prevent a law from Scottish Parliament going to royal assent. Alistair Jack says the gender bill would have serious adverse effects on the operation of the Equality Act.
The bill would have serious adverse effects on the operation of the Equality Act 2010. And as I've set out in my correspondence with the First Minister yesterday, I would prefer not to be in this situation. The United Kingdom Government does all we can to respect the devolution settlement and to resolve disputes. It is open to the Scottish Government to bring back an amended bill for reconsideration in the Scottish Parliament. So to conclude, Mr Speaker, I have set out to the Scottish Government that should they choose to do so, I hope we can work together to find a constructive way forward.
Dozens of people have been injured after a double-decker bus overturned in Somerset. The bus carrying 70 workers to the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station was involved in a collision with a motorcyclist this morning. Avon and Somerset police are urging people to only travel if essential due to the icy and freezing weather conditions. Hundreds have lost their jobs after the car battery company British Volt fell into administration. The company had plans to build a gigafactory in Northumberland, which was backed by former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Administrators EY have confirmed it failed to secure necessary funding. New figures show that wages have failed to keep up with soaring prices, more so than at any point since records began. The Office for National Statistics also says the unemployment rate rose by 0.2% to reach 3.7% over the same period. But the Chancellor says the labour market remains resilient. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Let's update you now on the latest on the various strikes, with teachers now set to strike over pay for England and Wales. The National Education Union announcing 7 dates. National strikes on the 1st of Feb, then the 15th and 16th of March. Meanwhile, Downing Street saying that the widespread strikes on February the 1st, including, of course, a rail strike, ASLEF, the drivers coming out, will likely cause significant disruption for the public. Those train drivers and 1,000 or 100,000 rather civil servants all stopping work. But let's get more with our national reporter Ellie Costello now, who's outside the National Education Union headquarters in London. And Ellie, you were talking to the union a little later, and clearly they are frustrated, as so many of the others in the public sector, about the failure of the government to come to terms with what they say is needed for a pay deal.
Yes, exactly, Mark. Good afternoon to you. And it became quite clear, speaking to the NEU earlier on, that this isn't just about pay. They had a 5% pay rise in 2022. This is also about recruitment of teachers and about retention of teachers. And there is a worry amongst the union that if things don't change, that there will be a big issue coming down the road with the recruitment and retainment of teachers. That's one of the reasons why they have voted for this strike action. 90% of teacher members in England and Wales said yes to strike action, but only a 53% turnout. I put that to Kevin Courtney, who is the Joint General Secretary of the NEU, and I put that point that this is only a narrow margin for their right to strike. This is what he told me.
This is a simply overwhelming endorsement of our campaign. It's the biggest result by any trades union since the government brought in this law about thresholds. The government is making a really big mistake if they think this isn't well supported. It's massively supported by our members. And the reason that teachers are supporting this sort of campaign is that they know there's a crisis in our schools. We put out some figures today. Over a quarter of physics lessons are being taught by somebody who doesn't have a degree or a postgraduate qualification in physics, a PGC in physics. 1 in 6 chemistry lessons, almost a half of computing lessons, 20% of D&T lessons, 10% of geography lessons, 10% of maths teachers. There's a real crisis in our schools because we can't recruit and then keep teachers in our schools, and pay is part of the answer to that.
Well, will schools close? Well, inevitably some will. It will depend, of course, on how many teachers in that school have decided to go out on strike. There will be a focus by head teachers to try and get volunteers and supply teachers in to keep classes going, but some students will inevitably have to go back to being homeschooled. But the difference, Mark, between what we saw in the pandemic with children being homeschooled and the teachers' strike that we're talking about now is that teachers do not have a responsibility on a strike day to set work for their pupils. So it could mean that we're seeing parents taking annual leave and having to teach their children with resources at home. Could be quite a challenge for those parents. And there's also pupils that will be rightly concerned about their upcoming exam season in May, their results coming up later on in the summer in August, and they will be concerned about what this latest disruption means for their education.
Indeed, with Gillian Keegan, of course, the Education Secretary, saying she can't guarantee that all those schools will stay open. A worrying time for the children and, of course, their parents. But, Ellie, thank you for updating us there, and we'll see how those various discussions continue and if they come to a settlement. Thank you very much. Well, meanwhile, UK wages have actually risen at the fastest rate in more than 20 years. But not all good news, because the real increase struggling to keep up with inflation. That's according to the latest official figures from the Office for National Statistics. Unemployment across the country also on the rise, reaching 3.7%, up from 3.5% in the 3 months leading up to November. But to talk more on pay now, let's speak to Luke Hilliard, Executive Director at the High Pay Centre. Luke, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And this is the issue, of course, that in cash terms, it looks pretty strong. And I think in percentage terms, the highest level or the highest increase for 20 years. But when you then take into account inflation, it brings the figures right down. And of course, this is at the heart of all these disputes with the government and the public sector unions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it kind of summarises the economic difficulties that we're going through, because obviously pay increases of 6%, 7% in the private sector in some parts of it are pretty expensive for businesses, for employers to afford. On the other hand, it's still well below 10% inflation, meaning that even people getting those big 6 or 7% pay increases, with the money they earn, they're still going out and they're able to buy less and less with their wages. So in real terms, as they say, it's a pay cut. So, you know, despite all the advances we see in science, technology around the world, despite businesses coughing up money to provide these pay increases, presumably great difficulty for them. What people can buy in real terms is falling, which is obviously a really terrible state of affairs.
At the moment, of course, with the inflation rate at what it is, but for the government, of course, what they are trying to argue is that, well, inflation may well fall pretty dramatically. We've got the latest figures tomorrow. Therefore, sort of one-off payments may be the way to navigate their way through this, to reflect on what we've had in very high inflation, but not then to embed it in terms of people's overall salary and national insurance and everything by paying a percentage increase.
Yeah, and in previous figures, that's what that seems to have been happening a bit. People have been getting these one-off cost of living payments to to deal with, energy bills, food prices, etc., that are rent increases that are really high at the moment. But today's figures actually showed that pay with or without bonuses was the increase was more or less at the same level, still below the rate of inflation in either case. I think the challenge with what the government is saying around bringing inflation down and not asking for huge pay rises that then feed inflation is that stagnating pay is not an especially recent phenomenon. If you look at pay in the UK going back to the financial crisis, 2007, 2008 sort of time, pay increases since then have been really meagre. Throughout most years in the 2010s, pay increases were below the rate of inflation. So in other words, people were effectively getting a real terms pay cut. So I think people will sort of struggle to believe that they should just, sit tight and wear the pay cuts that they're facing at the moment, and that things will get better, because actually, as I say, this isn't necessarily a recent phenomenon, and the evidence that if and when inflation wanes, it will get better. That's just not there.
Yeah, of course, and that's what the health unions have been arguing, that they have a decade of real terms cuts in terms of the austerity in health budgets. But we shall see what the inflation rate comes up with tomorrow and where that takes us. Luke, for the moment, thank you very much indeed for your time. Now, how would you feel if your beloved family pet was the victim of an airgun attack just metres from your own home? Well, in one street in Haywards Heath in West Sussex, there have been 4 such shootings. Police so far unable to find the culprit. Our South East of England reporter Ray Addison has the details for us.
A typical suburban street in Haywards Heath, West Sussex. But somewhere close there lurks what residents are calling a heartless shooter, an unknown attacker taking potshots at harmless cats. The latest victim lives here at number 8.
Oh, I know. The cuddles are nice, aren't they?
Frank was adopted just 2 months ago by Gemma and her partner Adam. But on New Year's Day, they found that he'd been shot with an airgun, the pellet entering his abdomen.
He had been out and about a little bit, and he came inside and he had this really bad limp, like really, really bad limp. And then we found this wound on him. We just panicked, had to get straight onto the emergency vet. And that's where they discovered that he had in fact been shot.
The damage it caused was extensive, and the vet's bill came to just under £5,000.
He had to have blood transfusions and major surgery. It was horrible seeing this happen to him. It was heartbreaking.
But it's not the first attack. Just 2 doors down at Dan's house, 2 defenceless kittens were targeted, and this time it proved fatal.
I bought Fred and Dusty as a surprise birthday present for Donna, my wife, and obviously our 3 boys. Fred was unfortunately shot back in October of 2021. He was nursed back to health, and then he was unfortunately shot again. This time, unfortunately, the damage to his insides was way too much. So he unfortunately had to be put down.
Now, all of these attacks were reported to the police, but when we contacted them for a statement, they told us that they don't believe they're linked, which residents say is surprising.
It's definitely linked. I think it's mad they're not.
It doesn't take a genius to work out that it must be linked.
The charity Cats Protection says attacks like these are all too common in England and Wales, where airguns are unlicensed and cats are frequently the target.
We see around 100 media stories every year about cats being attacked with air guns, but that's likely to be just the tip of the iceberg. We've already seen licensing for air weapons introduced in Scotland and Northern Ireland. At the moment, around 90% of the press stories we see about cats being attacked with air weapons are in England and Wales, which kind of indicates that there is a problem and that this really needs to be addressed by the government.
It could easily happen again, and we really don't know what we're going to do about him when he's allowed out.
If licensing does go ahead, Cats Protection believe that would give local police a better chance of tracking down the perpetrators of vicious attacks. Until then, residents may have no option but to keep their cats indoors. That or let them walk the streets, knowing there's a hunter on the prowl. Ray Addison, GB News.
Extraordinary story, that Haywards Heath in West Sussex, and of course the police reaction saying they don't believe that there's any link between the attacks. We'll update you on that story as we find out more, and I'm sure you've got a view on that. Don't forget that you can get in touch with us, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Many of you indeed have. Away from West Sussex Police, concerns about the Met, of course. Peter been in touch to say, I served as a police officer in 4 UK forces. The Met is different in a bad way. The general police officer routinely has a bad attitude. There's an ethos that the Met are the best force in the UK, world, etc., etc. The Met could learn a lot from local forces, but they won't. Excuse me. Anthony also saying of the police, this problem going back far beyond the 1970s with police officers with an attitude of superiority over the public they're supposed to serve, including lying, planting evidence and a general attitude that they are above the law. Meanwhile, Neil, in touch on Scottish gender bill, give us Scots a vote on it and we will let us see how we don't want a bill to go through. The vast majority of us don't want it. Why don't we get a say in it? Question mark. Well, let's just reflect on Boris Johnson for the moment, because the former Prime Minister has signed a book deal with publisher William Collins, owned by HarperCollins. No title or publishing date as yet, but being described as a memoir like no other. Promising, the publisher says, to offer momentous documentation of events seen by the United Kingdom in recent times. Wow. Well, let's get the views of John Rentoul, chief political commentator at The Independent. John is joining us now. Thank you very much for your time. What happened to the Shakespeare book then? I thought that was on the presses first.
Well, that's a very good question. Who knows which one he's going to do first? Because this biography isn't going to help him come.
Well, I think we just lost the signal for John. Let's see if we can get back to him. John, you're obviously just reflecting on the fact we haven't got the Shakespeare book, but perhaps this will be one of those Churchillian efforts, of course, Churchill being Boris Johnson's hero.
Well, yes, he's written a book about Churchill already.
I'm being told we're trying to get... John, are you there? Yes, you are. Splendid. Let's continue to chapter 2 and reflect on perhaps his Churchillian attitude and getting stuff down in print before others make their assessment.
Well, that's right. Churchill said he'd go down well in history because he was going to write it himself.
Yeah.
And I think Boris Johnson's got a similar attitude.
He's quite a good writer, of course, many people acknowledge that, but it's whether he'll be telling the truth in terms of his assessment of political events. And we are likely to get a pretty legalistic approach from the Commons in the inquiry into Partygate and so on. Is he just trying to get his version out before that happens?
No, I don't think he's going to be in any hurry to get his version out at all, because he can't really disclose anything interesting in this book without harming his chances of making a comeback.
So what do we expect then? Is it going to be something just to fill the bookshelves at the various sort of railway stationers and make him a quick buck?
Yes, I think that's absolutely fair. I think, as you say, it'll be full of jokes and, it'll be quite lively. But I don't think it's going to actually reveal a great deal that we don't already know about how Boris Johnson really ran the country, because he doesn't want to spike his guns for the next attempt.
Yeah. I mean, you are a journalist yourself. Would you welcome him coming back in terms of daily journalism? Because people, I think, do acknowledge that even though perhaps he's not been the most astute political operator, he is actually, quite readable.
Oh, absolutely, and continues to be. I mean, he carries on. He carries on writing. He's written some very entertaining diaries for The Spectator, his old magazine, even while he was Prime Minister. So, of course, I'd welcome him back to the journalistic trade with open arms.
And do you believe, as of course we remember that he wrote that book, The Churchill Factor, he sincerely believes that he can make a political comeback and rise again as Churchill did was it 1952, I think?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he does think he can come back. But I think writing his memoir is going to get in the way of that. because anything interesting that he has to say about his period in government is going to make it more difficult for him to be an effective Prime Minister next time.
Yeah, and perhaps that may be a consideration of trying to keep the way clear for a political comeback. But we shall see. And, of course, we shall see if the book actually makes it onto the shelves as well. John, thank you for that. And apologies for the break-up there in the signal where we got to it in the end. Thank you very much indeed. That's it from GB News Live for today, with me, Mark Longhurst, back in the chair. Great to be with you. We're back at 11:50 tomorrow. Of course, Prime Minister's Questions. Don't go away. Nana is coming up next.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Good afternoon. You're with me. I'm Nana Akua. I'm in for Patrick Christie. This is GB News Live on TV, online and on digital radio. Now, coming up this hour, last night it was the teachers and nurses who announced the dates for a